Okay, can everybody hear me out there?
Yes.
Wonderful.
Yes, sir.
Okay. About one more minute and we'll get started. And it looks like somebody sent a chat. Are the sessions being recorded? And yes, as I put in the announcements via Canvas.
Professor,
Yes.
do you hear me muffled or do you hear me fine?
Yeah, I hear you fine.
All right, perfect.
All right. Let's see. How many folks do we have? 1, 2, 3. Well, we're still missing quite a few folks. We'll wait another minute or two.
Hey, Fred.
Morning. Okay, well, let's go ahead and get started. All right, this is working. All right, so obviously there's some of you that were in my class for the previous 8 weeks, so you kind of know how everything works, but there's also obviously several new folks that are in this course that were not in that course, so I'm going to kind of go through the basic mechanics of just how this course operates and kind of what we're doing. We've obviously got several different cameras on here in the room. Specifically, we've got one that is kind of focused up here on me at the front. You really can't see any detail of what's on the screen because obviously it's just me sort of standing here. But we also have another camera that is set up that basically is kind of viewing what I see, which is over here. You see a big screen, and the way that I have it set up, it's like the whole Brady Bunch screen. So this is what I'm looking at whenever I'm obviously talking, lecturing, that sort of thing. So I'm looking at your faces, looking at your reactions. So the extent to which you have your cameras on, yes, I am looking at you, all right? And so that's a way for me to get a sense of, okay, are you paying attention? Do you understand what's going on? All that sort of stuff. All right. Also, you may be able to, I think, see in this, we have another camera that's set up over here. That camera is used to record exclusively the front screen, and that recording is placed on YouTube each week after class. So there's basically 2 recordings that take place in this course. One is of the Zoom session, so whatever pops up on your Zoom screen, yes, that will be recorded and available pretty much sometime later today. And then the Zoom, or in the YouTube video, will also be available sometime later today as well. I've sent you via email kind of the link to be able to go to the YouTube channel and subscribe to that channel. It's obviously got you know, I don't know how many, couple of thousand videos from the past several years of our courses in the program. And you can go through and obviously search those videos for, you know, previous semesters and that sort of thing. But part of the reason why we do the videos, at least on YouTube, and also to a certain extent on Zoom, is so that if you miss class for whatever reason, or you choose not to attend, whatever your sort of, I guess, approach to this is going to be, you've got the option to obviously watch it offline whenever you choose, okay? And the video recordings will be available, the Zoom recordings will be available all semester. The YouTube, in essence, you know, potentially forever. We never really take them down. So, with that, that's what you need to know about the recordings. Now, also, for this course, you've been sent a handful of emails, a handful of announcements via Canvas. And I'm going to communicate probably both ways, depending on what it is I'm trying to do or achieve or that sort of thing. Because some of you pay attention to Canvas more than you do your emails. Some of you have it all integrated, some of you don't. But always be paying attention to both Canvas as well as your normal NOVA email, and in terms of what I may be sending you. So, case in point, obviously I have sent you a copy of the syllabus for the course a couple of weeks back, for those of you that were registered at that point in time. Now the syllabus, the official NSU syllabus, is on the Canvas site. And let me explain just a little bit of kind of how I use Canvas, which may be a little bit different than how other people use Canvas. Technically, we're not an in-person class today.
Oh, we're not?
No, we're all via Zoom. The first class session is completely without anyone here.
Okay, what about the next one?
No, the next ones will be here. I mean, you're welcome to stay, but then we both have to wear a mask.
No, it's okay.
Go ahead. I mean, that's fine. Go ahead and stay. That's fine.
I mean,
All right. So once again, no, go ahead and have a seat. All right. So via Canvas, what I tend to do, which is maybe a little bit different than some other people in terms of how I use Canvas, is for the most part, I use it on a pretty limited basis. Okay. It's basically set up to make announcements to you, obviously, in terms of what's going to be happening with the course. You know, anything that you need to be aware of that's going to be happening. Usually we'll send, you know, files or handouts, that sort of thing via Canvas. But most importantly, it's also where you can go to take a look at the Zoom recordings for the course and be able to download those, view those on your own, you know, computer at your own time. And then finally, it's also where all the quizzes take place. So once again, you know, each week you'll have a quiz at the end of each class, okay? And the way the quizzes work in this course, there's a total of 8 class sessions, so there's 8 quizzes. And so in essence, I typically will have our lecture discussion until about 11:15, and then at 11:15, the quiz opens if you want to take it then, but you also have until Monday night, you know, in other words, after the weekend, you have until Monday night to complete the quiz. Once you start the quiz, you must complete it, okay? And you have one attempt at the quiz. It's 45 minutes in duration. Each quiz is typically going to be 10 questions. Almost all are going to be calculation-focused questions using your financial calculator or using Excel, whatever you choose to use, okay? That's your choice. The material on the quizzes will come pretty much directly from the lecture as well as from the readings, okay? So like, for example, today, obviously the reading was chapter 4, focused on leases. And so pretty much the whole lecture today and discussion will be focused on leases and calculations associated with leases. And then at the end of that, then we'll have a quiz, okay? Does that make sense, everybody? Now, each of those quizzes, in essence, there's, as I said, a total of 8 of them, so that works out to be roughly 12.5% of your grade for each of those quizzes, all right? Those are really the only grade components are the quizzes. Now, if, for whatever reason, you miss a quiz, or you don't perform well on a quiz, or several quizzes, you have the option of taking an optional midterm and an optional final, okay? The optional midterm will in essence cover the same content as the quizzes, in essence, so was 1, 2, 3, and 4, if you did well, then there's no need to take the optional midterm. If you didn't do as well as you wanted, then you're going to need to take, obviously, the midterm, which then will replace, basically, the quiz scores. Okay, does that make sense, everybody? All right? So that, in essence, becomes, 50% of your grade by taking that midterm. All right? Same thing applies for the final exam. Now, one thing I'm doing a little bit different in this class than what I did in the previous class was for the final exam. This final exam is not comprehensive. This one is just simply over the last 4, basically, quizzes. So basically, quizzes 5, 6, 7, and 8 will be covered on the optional final. Okay, does that make sense, everybody? All right, so in other words, you got 2 chances to do well, okay? And, if you don't do well on the quizzes, you've got the opportunity on the optional midterm and the optional final. And both of those, obviously, the way that it'll work is, let's say, immediately on Monday after taking the optional, or not the optional, but taking, let's say, quiz 4, you realize you haven't done well in those first 4 quizzes. That's whenever you are immediately going to email me and say, hey, I didn't do well on these quizzes. I want to take the optional midterm. So, here's your chance to be able to do that, okay? Make sense? And then you'll have until the end of that week, typically by Friday at midnight, to be able to do so, okay? All right, any questions on that? Okay, all right. I'm sorry?
I have a question. Are we allowed to take the quizzes even though we wouldn't come into the lecture, or do we have to come into the lecture in order to take the quizzes?
No, okay. So obviously the lectures are recorded. And for whatever reason, if you choose to not be here during the lectures, and obviously have the opportunity to ask questions and interact with me and obviously the other fellow students in the class, you can do so. Watch the recordings from the class, and then take the quizzes by Monday night. Okay? Does that make sense?
Perfect, thank you.
Okay?
Professor,
Yep.
are you going to give us like 10 subheadings for today's lesson, or is it just going to be a couple and then they'll be extended for the rest of the time?
It's all going to be about leases, so just kind of follow along as we go through, and you'll pick up where we're going. All right? Okay. Any other questions before we kind of get started? Anything else that I left out from those of you that obviously were in class last semester, or the first 8 weeks? Okay? All right, in that case, let's go ahead and get started. All right, so the big topic is all about commercial leases. And so where do we begin with that? And the way that I tend to sort of think about this is from a commercial real estate perspective, probably one of the most important things associated with the properties that you may own or obviously invest in, develop. You're going to be concerned about where your money is coming from, all right? And so you're concerned about not only where the money is coming from, but specifically how much is being paid to you, when it's being paid to you, under what conditions it's being paid to you. Is it going to change over time? Are there going to be potential options for basically incentives for the tenants to potentially perform at a higher level in terms of percentage rents? So there's a lot of different kinds of issues that are centered around leases. But ultimately, at the end of the day, what we're really focused about is obviously what sort of money that we're going to be bringing into the property. Well, one of the things that we have to make a distinction between at the very, very beginning of all of this are what are the differences between gross leases and net leases. Okay? Well, the way that I tend to sort of look at this is pretty much the gross lease is where the landlord or the owner pays for expenses. And typically under a net lease, just the opposite. The tenant typically pays for expenses. Now, what do we mean here? Okay, well, let's say that we're dealing with a shopping center, let's say we're dealing with an office building, whatever it might be. The question is, who is going to pay for what? All right? So, you might say to a potential retail tenant, hey, your lease, $20 per square foot per year. And you've got, let's say, 10,000 square feet that you're leasing. So, very basically, taking 20 times 10,000, that's going to mean $200,000 in lease payments. Okay? But what I haven't said is what that includes, or what that doesn't include. Okay? Most of you have the mindset of a typical sort of residential kind of lease, in a residential sort of tenant perspective. And as a residential tenant, what do you pay for versus what does the property owner pay for? Well, typically in a residential lease, you pay for what? Okay, Zoom gallery, anybody?
Base?
You pay for the common area.
You don't pay any fees except for your operating expenses like water and electricity.
Utilities, basically.
Utilities.
Okay? That's pretty much about the only thing that you pay for as a residential tenant. You pay for, your electricity usually. You sometimes pay for your water, sometimes that's included in the rent. You pay for, obviously, phone service. If you have a phone, you pay for internet service. If you have internet, you pay for gas. If you have gas. All of that you would typically, pay for as a residential tenant. But even then, that's not always going to be the case, because I'm sure that some of you have lived in residential properties where, water was included, or internet was included, or even in some cases electricity was included, okay? And so, the question is, once again, what is it that you're paying for versus what is it the property owner, investor is paying for, okay? So getting back to the little problem up here on the board, okay, so we've got this tenant, they're paying $20 a square foot per year for 10,000 square feet, $200,000 a year in lease payments. So assuming, let's say for a moment, this is a retail tenant, all right? What does that really cover? Well, it could just cover the rent and nothing else, okay? In other words, that's just their base rent, okay? Then on top of that, we might have what are called CAM charges, common area maintenance charges. Now those common area maintenance charges can include a whole bunch of different things. They may not necessarily be just property maintenance, property repair, that sort of thing. They can also, could be the utilities get sort of slung through the common area maintenance depending on how the utilities are set up in the property. I have owned properties and I have been a tenant in properties where, nothing, is consistent in terms of how it's done. I have owned properties where, let's say I've got 5 different retail tenants, 2 of them maybe are sharing the same electricity or the same sort of account for electric service, and the other 3 independent of each other. And then other instances, and like that same sort of property, which was really strange just because of the way it was set up originally, same sort of thing on trash service. Trash service, which may cost a couple $100 for the building, that you in essence may have to parse it out, space by space. Could also be that, once again, a couple of the tenants have their own trash service, another couple of tenants have something else. So my point with this is this common area sort of maintenance can, be broken out by the number of tenants, could be broken out by the square footage of the tenants, could be, covering a whole wide variety of things. And this is, in some cases, these common area maintenance charges border on almost being criminal. And what I mean by that is, let's assume that you're a property owner and you're trying to do your best to entice tenants into your property. What do you want to promote as your lease rate? You want to promote the lowest dollar possible in terms of what you're advertising on a very basic level, yes? Okay? And so, if you're promoting and advertising $20 a square foot, but yet your $20 a square foot happens to be what is referred to as an absolute triple net lease, what that means is that the tenant is going to pay for every single possible thing about that property, okay? But if you have a competitor down the street that may be charging, I don't know, $25 a square foot, but it's gross, so in other words, you could have a battle over here, $25 per square foot gross versus $20 per square foot net. That difference of $5 a square foot, theoretically, is about who's paying for what, all right? If this is an absolute gross lease in the sense of all-inclusive for $25 a square foot, then what we would be saying, and that absolute gross, that's an all bills paid lease. Meaning your electricity is covered, your utilities are covered, anything that happens to the property, the landlord's gonna fix it, no issues at all. It's, to me, the closest, in some cases, that you can relate to with kind of a gross lease sort of environment is like living in a residence hall or a dorm on a university campus, because there, usually, most everything is baked into kind of an upfront, fixed price, all-inclusive sort of package, okay? And so you pay that flat fee for the space, either by semester or by month or whatever it might be. Whereas, on the other end of the spectrum, with an absolute net lease, here, once again, you as the tenant are basically responsible for everything. Okay? Now, sort of the best example of like an absolute triple net lease is going to be something like a big box tenant, like a Walgreens, a CVS, a lot of different restaurants that kind of, are occupying a single use sort of building. And in that case, those tenants, as a general rule, are going to be responsible for everything that happens to that property, all right? And so, if a window gets broken out, the tenant is going to have to replace it. If the roof needs to be repaired, the tenant's going to have to fix it. Parking lot needs to be redone, the tenant's going to have to fix it. In the absolute triple net sort of environment, okay? In the absolute sort of gross environment, the tenant doesn't have to do anything. The tenant just kind of, once again, they pay their fees up front, in terms of the rent, and then they're covered for anything that happens to the property and all expenses included. Now, the reason I like to sort of use these two extremes is because then you kind of get a sense of, okay, this is what we're dealing with. We have, you know, the absolute triple net over here on this side, and we have the absolute gross over here on this side. But the reality is, in practice, most leases are going to fall somewhere in between those two extremes, okay? In terms of who's going to pay for what, how much are they going to pay, what are going to be the conditions of those payments, and so forth, all right? Does that make sense? Yes? No? Possibly? Okay. Now, so getting back to like this simple little example, I have a property, let's say that I'm leasing, and I'm saying it's $20 a square foot. My competitor down the street, more of a gross lease, 25 bucks a square foot. The question, and this is the sort of thing that you kind of step back and think about from the perspective of both the owner as well as the prospective tenant. From the owner's perspective, you know, they're thinking, hey, I'm marketing my property for 20 bucks a square foot. That is going to make me more appealing, okay? This other property owner for 25 bucks a square foot, they're simply saying, hey, you know, my property is great, come and move in here because you don't have to worry about any of these extra fees and charges and that sort of thing. So they, in other words, would have to market it in such a way where prospective tenants would be aware of that. But the reality is, in a lot of cases, some tenants are just not that sophisticated, okay? Now, you know, obviously, if you're a large, you know, national sort of retail tenant, you've been around the block a few times, okay? And you understand this stuff, and you understand the differences and the nuances that exist in one market versus another market, you know, in terms of who's paying for what, how much is being paid. And that's why, for a lot of like national retail tenants, the tenant, if they have that much sort of market authority or market dominance, in many cases they will come in with their own sort of lease and say to the property owner, hey, if you want us as a tenant, you're going to pretty much, you know, adhere to the lease that we're bringing to the table, as opposed to the other way around. All right? Now, that doesn't mean that, you know, that property owner is going to absolutely have to accept that. It just simply means that might be the starting point of negotiation to potentially get to a point of where both sides are kind of comfortable with, once again, who's paying for what and under sort of what conditions. All right? Make sense? Now, from your perspective, if you were to own a building, once again, let's just say it's an office building. What would be your preference as the owner of that building as to whether or not you charged more of a gross lease versus a net lease? Any of you?
The net lease.
Okay, but why?
Because I don't have to take care of the expenses and it doesn't matter how much water or electricity the tenant uses.
Okay, all right, I think those are good points. Okay, anybody else have a similar or different perspective?
Yeah, I would say that it depends on how comfortable you are with operating your operating environment. If you're somebody that's totally new, like you're saying, an inline tenant that has no expertise and really prior operating experience, I would probably say gross lease, but then if you're a big guy, then net.
Okay. So, let me throw a wrench into this. What about if your property happens to be an extremely energy efficient building? Okay? In other words, the property that you own, that you're leasing out, this office building, relative to your competitors within the market, that your building happens to be exceedingly energy efficient, okay? I mean, you have gone through all of the different sort of LEED certifications in terms of getting basically this designation of saying, hey, you're LEED Platinum, so that pretty much means that you are the best of the best with regard to energy efficiency. So, in other words, your electricity costs are in terms of like air conditioning cost, in terms of water consumption, in terms of, you know, a whole number of other sort of features is going to make your property that much less expensive to operate, okay? So taking that in context with, let's say, other competing properties within the market that maybe don't have that, would that potentially, for either of you that just spoke up, would that change your answer in some way? Or anybody else for that matter, thinking that through?
Slightly raise the price for them, but I'd stick with net.
I would stick with net because of the fact that you can still give them a discount on the square footage to be competitive, but you still have the opportunity to charge on other things throughout the year to make more profit on the camp. So if you go gross, you're going to eliminate yourself from making extra money throughout the year as a landlord.
Okay, anybody else? Go ahead.
Besides utilities, you know, in a triple net lease, they pay for property taxes and insurance,
Correct.
which is a big expense for the landlord as well.
It's also easier
the option to bring-
as a net lease, because typically a modern building like that would have, you know, every space sub-metered as well, you know, the utilities.
Kip, I'm sorry, I didn't catch the very first part of what you were saying.
So, you know, it's typically a building that's, you know, a modern building that's, you know, energy efficient. Every suite is sub-metered, especially if it's LEED certified, so it's easier to get that, allocate those expenses.
And I would agree with that, but even with the most modern, you know, buildings, you're still going to have maybe situations of where you're not maybe able to completely isolate. Like, for example, imagine you're in a high-rise. You know, in many instances, the metering may be by floor. And so you know, and if you start reconfiguring space on that floor, that maybe you start out with one tenant, but then over time, you know, it gravitates into 3, 4, 5, or 10 different tenants, then going back and having to try to, you know, figure out precisely, well, which part are we sub-metering, you know, once again, that could be very complicated. And that is part of the reason why, I mean, you're absolutely correct, that in the most modern of office buildings, whenever they're built, there's at least an attempt to try to, you know, come up with some sort of a structure where you can have more sub-metering going on than what has historically been the case, where it may be literally the whole building is on one meter, and then you're just charging utilities strictly based upon the amount of square footage they occupy, you know. But, you know, you're absolutely correct. But getting back specifically to my point with this is, how much in your mind, this is the question I'm trying to isolate, how much in your minds does the market, in terms of information, absorb with respect to things like super energy efficient building versus super non-energy efficient building? You know, how much of that in terms of market information is truly conveyed, accepted, acknowledged, and used by tenants whenever they're looking for space? Do you follow what I'm asking?
Yeah, I believe, going back to the question that you initially proposed to us, from a energy efficient building, the tenant and the property owner have two different interests in the property.
Yep.
The tenant is there, and his primary business is to operate his business. The owner of that building's interest is to operate an energy efficient building, and so he market that particular attribute. So to be able to, as an owner, to control the energy efficiency of that building, to me, I would want to be the owner who does that and not leave it up to the tenant, because the tenant, if he's a restaurant, let's say a retailer, you know, this guy may be a type of person that comes in and he's operating his restaurant, and he leaves the water running, he leaves the lights on in certain areas. As a owner, I can't control that, so I need to be able to document and be able to control the waste calculation. So for me, it would be a growth.
Okay. All right. And go ahead, Claudia.
I I think in a case like this fancy energy efficient, it is more important for the landlord or the owner to make sure that the building stays in good shape and is taken care of properly. And he will be also maybe, even though he will have a higher rent, he will make sure that this is understood. But if he pays little money for the electricity, he will be very market competitive with his per square footage. So he wants to make sure that it's well taken care of, so he wants to do it himself. And I think he will be competitive in the per square footage market. I don't think he can control how much the restaurant can use the water or not.
Right, okay. So here's what I'm trying to get at, and maybe I'm not doing as great of a job as I could in terms of kind of articulating this. But okay, let's put yourself in the developer's shoes here for a second. All right? You're a developer, and you have a lot of choices that you can make whenever you develop a property. One of those choices deals with, obviously, the energy efficiency piece, okay? And barring local government, or state or federal regulations that dictates, what you have to do or don't have to do, very simply put, let's just isolate one specific issue, air conditioning, okay? You can have a very basic sort of air conditioning system that will do the job, but use up a tremendous amount of electricity in doing so, okay? And that air conditioning unit, the base price of it would be relatively low, okay? But the operating cost is ridiculously high. Does everybody follow? Versus the other alternative, in a very simplistic way, you buy a ridiculously energy efficient air conditioning system, more expensive up front, but yet yields huge savings in terms of electric consumption and electrical cost. Okay, does that make sense to everybody? Yes or no? I'm trying to, once again, set up a paradigm that you can kind of, think about kind of two extremes. The question is, do prospective tenants appreciate that? And do they understand that? Are they willing to, in essence, pay more in a lease rate for a property, knowing that their electricity consumption is going to be substantially less? So in other words, they would pay a higher net lease cost, but their electricity cost would be substantially less in that energy efficient sort of property, versus the alternative, they pay a low lease rate, but yet then they've got these astronomical, energy costs. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay?
Yes.
So here, but here's another piece to this. I'm trying as a developer to value engineer what I'm building. And I'm saying to myself as the developer, is the tenant really going to care about any of that? Or are they going to really reward me for any of that? And so my perspective as a developer could very well be, hey, I'm putting the cheapest air conditioning system I can in this property. As long as it's functional, that's what I'm going to do, because the reality, the tenant's paying the bill with respect to the energy cost and that lease environment. So why do I care as the property owner to actually provide this service or this quality standard? Kip, I can tell you want to say something.
I was gonna say, I would say that probably your market, it's like your big corporate tenant, with multi branches, that they probably would be more interested in that because they have a market can be a good corporate citizen.
They're more sophisticated.
Yeah, whereas a local law office, they might not care.
Yeah, they don't really have a clue. I mean, any more than you, think about yourselves. That you go out, I don't know, house hunting, apartment hunting, or whatever, and how many of you really investigate what the electricity costs are going to be for one house or one apartment versus another? you might ask, a general question, well, what do the utilities normally run, or that sort of thing. But how much of an expanse does there have to be in order for you to potentially say, hey, maybe I should really pay more attention to this? You follow what I'm saying? I mean, on a very micro level, I remember a number of years ago I was redeveloping some property in Texas, and it was an older building built in the late 1800s, and I was building it for residential lofts. And I had a competitor that was literally across the street from me, and they also were redeveloping their building into loft apartments as well. Big difference between the two of us was in their property on the second floor, they had these massively high ceilings with these beaded board ceilings. I mean, it was just, amazing space in a sense. And that was before it was very popular to start insulating the roof in the sense of being able to put things like foam-based roofs on buildings. So the building, and they didn't want to cover up this beautiful wooden beaded ceiling. The reality was, this thing was a money pit with respect to energy consumption. That the monthly, like in a loft apartment, and I'm not exaggerating, I swear to God when I say this, I'm not exaggerating. The electric bill was like $1,000 a month, okay, for these units. Well, what happened is pretty much a tenant would come in and go, woo, this is amazing. And then they would stay there for the lease term, and then they would immediately move out because they're like, this is insane, paying $1,000 a month for electricity. I'm going to go find somewhere that's obviously more energy efficient or certainly not that level of expense. You follow me? The property I owned, it just happened to be the case that I did kind of go to the extreme of over-insulating it. And so for the same size unit, my electric consumption would be like $50 to $75 a month, And so, it's how much, in some cases, does the market really appreciate that? You follow what I'm asking, okay? Now, I'm trying to make it a very micro example, but I mean, Kip is absolutely right. Major corporate tenants have people that specialize, obviously, in this sort of thing, and they would, go out to a prospective property that they're looking at in terms of occupying, and they're going to do, probably some sort of an energy audit or, utility audit to get a feel for what is going to be my true cost of occupancy, for this property, as opposed to just kind of like, okay, well, this property looks nice, I guess we'll lease it and sort of move in, and then you find out after the fact, okay? Thoughts, comments, observations?
Yeah, I would say that the $5 is really that the tenant has to understand the value that's being added. So like to add to what you're saying, Professor, you have to understand what your operating expenses are going to be. Maybe they're only going to be $2. And so the $5 extra would be something dramatic for you. And I'd also like to note that there's risk that's being shifted around dependent on these two leases. And in the gross lease, the landlord is taking on a lot of the risk. And so that's probably going to be more for somebody that doesn't have as much operating experience, like I'm saying, where
right.
In that triple net lease, where Kip is saying, you're going to have a corporate real estate team who's going in there and understanding the implied risk that they're going to be taking on. And for them, they'd be able to add a lot more value to their portfolio by having that because they understand their operating expenses,
sure.
the business, and the market a lot more efficiently than maybe like an inline tenant.
Right. And so, wait, Jeremy, you had something?
Yeah, okay, as a tenant, I'm a real estate agent too, but as a tenant, because I've had to lease commercial space for business that I own, and I found that as a new starting business, it's always best to look for a gross lease because of the fact that my experience with triple net leases, you never know what the cost is going to be at the end of the year with the camp. So the landlord can throw whatever he wants at you. He could say that he redone the parking. He could say that he's saving for the roof. He could say whatever he wants and tackling on a bill at the end of the year that you have to come up with. plus your monthly CAM. So some tenants charge you, some landlords will charge you a monthly CAM, and at the end of the year send you a CAM revision bill.
Right.
Which makes it like extremely expensive if you're starting a new business or you had a bad year. So,
right. And that's what I was saying earlier, and I was not joking when I said it, that in some cases these CAM charges, can be bordering on criminal, because it's like you're luring people in with this sort of low, triple net sort of lease, but then, it's like, woo, all of a sudden we're gonna bake in all of these other charges and fees and everything else into these common area maintenance, charges that we're gonna assess you on a monthly, quarterly, annual basis. And then, as Jim was just saying, that, you kind of get around at the end of the year and you're sort of looking at what your true cost of occupancy were. You thought they were going to be, $20 a square foot, but the reality was maybe they were closer to 30 or 35 bucks a square foot with all these extra sort of CAM charges thrown in. Okay? All right? Thoughts, questions, observations? Okay, Juliet?
The other thing is it's interesting that you're bringing up energy efficiency, because I just spent the last 4 years in Southern California, and everything runs a little different around there, and
right.
A lot is done by solar. And so they lure you in residentially and commercially with solar, it's so cheap, and it's so green. But what you don't realize is solar doesn't charge you except for annually. So your solar is running, and in the winter it's higher every month because the sun isn't beaming down, and in the summer it's lower. But you have to pay it annually. You don't pay it monthly. There's no option. So they lure you in with, oh, you won't have an electric bill, but then every year you're paying $20,000 come November for your year of expenses. So it's interesting that we're talking about the efficiency programs, because as a landlord, I would put solar on my roof in 2 seconds because of the breaks, because it's exciting to tenants, especially in whatever environment you're in. Like here in Florida, people are a little bit not as into like green, I think, as in maybe the West Coast.
Right.
So I've noticed that it's not only, you really have to know from the developer side who is going to be renting your space.
Right.
And if they care about being green, because the green is kind of crazy when you get hit with a $20,000 bill every year.
Yeah, and that's the thing that one of the things that you won't necessarily hear me doing is promoting green for the sake of being green. And I'm not saying that it's bad to do that. That's not what I'm trying to. I'm not trying to get political or anti-political as it relates to this. But my perspective, just looking at it from a business sort of efficiency and kind of effectiveness, and what is it that can be done to try to reduce operating costs past those operating cost savings to the tenants, but somehow, I guess the big point I'm trying to make with this, the tenants have to become aware of, and the tenants have to embrace and understand they're getting a good deal as a result of having this more energy efficient sort of property than the alternative. Okay? Does that make sense, everybody? Okay. Let us move forward. I think you get the general idea. All right, so one of the things that we want to maybe talk about is where we have step-ups in rent. All right, so it is quite common in a commercial lease, especially longer term leases, and that's the thing, let's just talk about that for a second. Almost the typical standard normal sort of residential lease is what? 1 year, okay? Whereas for commercial tenants, at a minimum, usually it's 3 years or 5 years, okay? And at a maximum, could be 20 or 30 years, okay, or more, you know, depending on the circumstance and the type of tenant and the arrangement with the property owner or the landowner, if there's a ground lease, all that sort of stuff. But the reality is, we're talking in some cases about very long periods of time that the tenant may be in that space. And so as a result of that, that changes things a little bit in terms of how they sort of deal with, you know, rental increases or rental changes, okay, over that time period. Because chances are you're not going to, you know, as a retail or office or, you know, industrial tenant, walk into a property owner and say, hey, I want to lease your property for the next, you know, 20 years, and here's the lease rate that I want to pay, and that's the same lease rate that I want to pay for the next 15 years. You know, that's pretty much not going to happen, okay? Now, could it happen? Sure. You know, but you know, most property owners are going to say, hey, wait a minute, yeah, I'd love to have you for 15 years and commit to a 15-year lease, but I want, you know, some protection in there as the owner of that property, that as market conditions change, that potentially my rental income is going to change as well. And so what they may have embedded within the lease could be step-up provisions, or, you know, just automatic rental increases or adjustments based on maybe like a consumer price index, could be based on the overall market value, could be based on what prevailing rental rates are in that particular market. You know, some sort of an independent appraiser comes in every few years, like maybe every 5 years, let's just say. So you're locked in for the first 5 years at a specific rate, and then at the end of that 5 years, you know, both the landlord as well as the tenant may be on edge because you have this independent third-party appraiser that kind of comes in and says, hey, rent rates have gone up by so many dollars a square foot in this particular market, so therefore we've got a big rental adjustment coming your way. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, so let's just say we've got a property and the lease rate, the standard lease rate is $20 per square foot per year. Now, here's one of the things that's also sort of different about the commercial market, commercial lease market, than the residential market. And why it's this way is really more of just historical kind of context, I guess. There's no good solid reason as to why it's just kind of how it's sort of evolved over time. But rental rates for commercial space are almost always quoted on a per square foot per year basis. Whereas residential might be something like, you know, $1.50 per square foot per month. Okay? But what that actually means, if you really want to kind of multiply it out for that residential, that would be the equivalent of $18 per square foot per year, much like the $20 per square foot, if we were to divide that by 12, would be like $1.67 per square foot per month, okay? But you will almost never ever hear commercial space ever being quoted on a monthly basis, okay? I mean, they may, no, let me take that back. They may quote the total rental rate, like $5,000 per month. Yes, they'll do that. But in terms of usually the per square foot cost of commercial space, you will almost never ever hear it quoted on a monthly basis, okay? It's almost always going to be quoted on an annual basis. And then, as I said, for residential, you know, whenever you have people, especially talking about apartment complexes, you know, the typical comparison is going to be the per square foot per month. Okay, everybody cool with that? Yes? Thoughts, comments, observations on that? Not overly complicated, but just making sure that you're there.
Is there like a weird reason why that is?
I mean, all I can tell you is, you know, in markets over time, things just happen and things just evolve. And you have like major market players that may, you know, essentially have set a particular set of ways in which things are expressed in one market versus another, and then it just sort of sticks, and that's the way it is kind of from that point forward with no real good solid reasoning behind it. Much the same way, and this is actually kind of an interesting thing, you know, as I was talking about, you know, the whole net lease versus gross lease thing, there are certain markets, certain cities that will be predominantly one or the other, okay? Because once again, some major player comes into the market and starts, you know, establishing, you know, kind of lease rates, and everybody else wants to kind of, you know, have an apples to apples comparison, so they just start doing the same thing. And so what's kind of interesting, I mean, some of you may know that for a few years I taught, you know, down in New Zealand, and taught at the University of Auckland in New Zealand, and it was kind of an interesting thing because you had two cities in the country of New Zealand, one of which, or big cities, one of which was Auckland, you know, had a couple of, you know, million people, or well, 1.5 million, whatever. And then you had Wellington, which was the capital city, almost all government tenants. Well, what was interesting was that virtually all of the leases in Wellington, which was, as I said, kind of a center of government, were all gross leases. Where in Auckland, much more of a kind of business-focused city, almost all the leases were net leases. So my point is, you know, here you are within a relatively small country, but yet you have this huge variation of how leases are done. And so it's like if you're let's say a tenant that, you know, and you've got locations both in Auckland and Wellington, and you initially sort of take a look at the two price points, you're saying, oh my God, why is Wellington so much more expensive? Well, it's because it's a gross lease, okay? Does that make sense? All right? But, you know, same sort of thing, you know, exists here, you know, in the US, that you'll have certain cities that just simply happen to kind of get stuck in one or the other, okay, for whatever it's worth. Okay, so getting back up here for a second, and let's go back to just pretty much just focusing on the commercial side of things. Get rid of all this extra stuff here for a second. Back up here to our commercial. All right. Question?
You're saying something about, I think, I don't know if Alex was asking why did people choose to do the square footage for common area compared to residential? I think, was that the answer? I was trying to figure out what the line of thought you were going from with the line of thought he was asking. I was trying to figure
well, my understanding of Alex's question, and Alex can correct me if I'm wrong, was, you know, what sort of the origins of it being charged one way versus the other. Is that correct, Alex?
Yeah, exactly like that. Just more of like a weird nuance of why it was monthly versus annual.
Oh, okay, yeah, okay, so that's what you meant, like the square footage for the annual and monthly, okay, because residential is more likely I'm living in it. So it's cut up by monthly because you're looking at the space that I'm living in it. Annually, the reason they do commercial annually is because it's a profit base. The more space I have, the more profit I make, and the landlord's looking at, okay, you're renting the space as a tenant to make profit, not to live in it. So you're looking at it as, if I'm paying $20 per square foot per year, how does that equate to my annual profit or my expenses? How much more profit I get out of that space? So that's why it's to be a different way with residential, because residential you're living there monthly per year. Commercial wise, I got to be there with yeah,
okay. All right. So in that case, let's kind of get back to this whole idea of sort of the step in rent. So what can probably happen is, you know, you've got your initial year being $20 per square foot per year for the commercial space, and then you say, all right, every year we're going to maybe step that up by, you know, a couple of dollars per square foot. all right? And so, if that's the case, then every year we're going to go up. Now, that would be an amazing thing from a property owner's perspective to have that level of increase each year, but it's like a 10% increase. So, you've got to be happy with that. But anyway, let's just assume that's the case. So, it would say that, okay, well then, what that means is that we're sort of talking about, right here, right now in year one, our lease rate is 20 bucks a square foot. Then in year two, it'd be like 22, year three, 24, and so forth, so on. All right? So that's pretty straightforward. But you could also have that step-up provision, instead of being a dollar amount, could also just simply be a percentage. That you just simply say, as the property owner and the tenant, what you've negotiated is every year, maybe the rent's going to go up by 5%, okay? Yet again, what property owner would not like that, okay? Not as good as 10%, but still, nonetheless, not bad. So let's just say that we put that, so instead of just a flat dollar amount per year, we said, okay, rental increases of 5% per year, okay? Then what would we do? All right, well, if we started in year one, it's still going to be 20 bucks a square foot. But then a subsequent year, the easiest way to do it is to basically multiply that 20 times itself, or 1, plus whatever that growth rate is. So in this case, 5%. All right? So we can sort of shorten this, instead of 20 times, open parentheses, 1 plus 0.05, we can just simply say 20 times 1.05. So you're multiplying it by itself plus the 5%. So you would get $21 a square foot. So basically, with the 5% per year, what we would be saying is, okay, year one is the 20, year two is going to be 21, so what's year three going to be? You're going to take basically the 21 and then multiply it by 1.05, and what you would end up with is 22.05, so you get a little bit of extra change in there. So basically year one is 20, year two is 21, year three would be 22.05, okay? Everybody make sense with that? Everybody feel good with that? Yes or no? Any questions? And did you have a question? You kind of look like, okay.
So you increased it by 5% every year? So
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. Now, also, sort of within this, we could be making other adjustments to the rent, that we could go from, let's say, charging somebody more of a gross rent, kind of 20 bucks a square foot, to saying, all right, we're going to put into place basically a situation of where the tenant is going to be responsible for a certain dollar amount of operating expenses, okay? And so what we might say is going from, let's say, a $20 gross, that we might be willing to go to a system of a net lease, but we want them to pick up, let's say, $10 of sort of, well actually let me do a number not 10 because that's going to kind of make things confusing. Let's see. Let's go with $8. So $8 of expenses that are going to be passed through to the tenant. So that's a very sort of set of keywords. Passed through to the tenants. Okay, what does that mean? Have you ever heard that before? Okay, expenses passed through to the tenants. That means that as the property owner, obviously there are a whole bunch of different expenses that I would ordinarily incur in operating the building. Could be the utilities, could be property taxes, insurance, maintenance, whatever, okay? But once again, in the negotiations between the landlord and the tenant, I could choose to pass through certain expenses directly to the tenant that they would then be responsible for paying. Okay, does that make sense? All right, so for example, I can say I'm going to pass through all of the utilities, all of the property taxes, all of the insurance to the tenants. So what that means is they're going to be responsible for all of those things. Okay? Now, what I can also do is I can say, while I'm passing through certain expenses to the tenants, I can also have something called an expense stop. Okay? Anybody ever heard of that? Give me a bobbing head, yes or no? Okay. An expense stop pretty much is, being able to say, all right, we're going to limit the expenses, okay? And if they get above a certain amount, then I, as the property owner, am going to stop paying them, okay? All right? So that we're going to sort of, like for example, let me put it, like somebody used the example of water previously. What I'm going to do as the property owner will say, okay, if I were just isolating out water as one of the expenses, I will pay your water bill up to a certain dollar amount. If you exceed that dollar amount, then you are now responsible as the tenant. Does that make sense? Okay? But now there's an embedded opportunity here as well. That depending on at what level you set, kind of that expense stop could work to your advantage or disadvantage as the property owner. Let's just say hypothetically that, and this is once again not dealing with the problem specifically that we have on the screen right now, but let's just say hypothetically we have a property where we know that the average water bill is $100 a month, okay? And so what we pretty much do as the property owner is we say, all right, I'm going to set this expense stop around $100 for water. But the thing is, if the tenant does not reach that $100 sort of expense stop, I get to keep the money as the property owner. Does that make sense? The difference. Like for example, if basically they only use $75 worth of water instead of $100, then I get to keep that extra $25. And I'm happy as the property owner. But then if they exceed the $100, then they are responsible to pay whatever that amount is, basically reimburse me for that expense. And that also gets into another sort of concept that ties in with sort of the expense stop, are sort of reimbursables. And so, this is a situation of where, once again, as the tenant, by virtue of your lease, that you are going to be responsible ultimately for paying the property taxes, let's say on a property. All right, so I get a bill for $10,000 as the property owner for property taxes. So what I'm going to do, in essence, is I may go ahead and write a check myself for the property taxes, or I might just simply pass through that expense directly to the tenant, and then they would potentially, if I've written a check, they would reimburse me for those property taxes having been paid. Does that make sense? Okay, so it's just kind of a question of how you sort of want to set it up. That you may want to set it up, you just immediately pass the bill on to the tenant, they pay for it directly to the property taxing authority, or you pay it, then you simply get reimbursed by the tenant. And so this is one of the things, how many of you are in the Argus class right now? Okay, have y'all gotten into the whole issue of like reimbursable expenses and things like that using, okay. Well, hopefully you will, because that is, part of this whole sort of lease by lease sort of cash flow modeling that Argus is an excellent tool to use, because think of it like this. We've talked about all these, and we're going to talk about more, but we've talked about all these different sort of lease conditions that we have between a landlord and a tenant. Well, imagine for a moment that, you're kind of almost, making the general assumption that every tenant has the same deal as every other tenant. At least maybe on a square foot basis or whatever. And they may. But it's quite possible, and more than likely, almost very probable, that every tenant has a different deal, okay? Depending on whenever they leased the property, or depending on their strength as a particular tenant of a national reputation versus more of a local reputation. And so, as a result of that, that could dictate not only what dollar amount they pay in terms of a rental rate, but also what they may end up having to pay in terms of reimbursables, or what sort of arrangement they may have in terms of expense stops, what sort of stair-stepping up of rent they may have, and how that gets adjusted. Not to mention that, let's just say that, this is, keep it simple, let's say you've got 10 different tenants, okay? Each one probably has a different start date of their lease and a different ending date. Each one has a different lease rate. Each one has a different sort of payment scheme of how much they're responsible for or what they're responsible for, and so forth, so on. Well, imagine the brain damage that you would have to go through as a property owner to try to reconcile all of that in a way that's actually meaningful, so that you can roll up into one big sort of operating statement, okay? That's what Argus does for you, okay? That's why I'm sort of giving a little bit of a commercial, if you will, for Argus, because Argus allows you to go in and be able to individually model every single lease and then roll them up into kind of one massive sort of, here are my cash flows, here are my expenses, and so forth, so on, and allow you to also, within Argus, make some predictive modeling based upon the likelihood of lease renewal, or what the prevailing market rate is for this particular type of property, and what kind of property it is, whether it's, once again, retail versus office versus something else. Okay, does that make sense? Yes? Okay. So, all of that kind of coming back here for a second, that let's say that, once again, as the property owner, we've got a $20 gross, but we're saying we now are going to, in essence, cover $8 per square foot of expenses for the tenant going into this sort of arrangement, so that our net would now be $12 a square foot. Okay? So in this case, we've sort of said, all right, that we're willing to cover basically $8 a square foot as, in essence, the owner of the property, but by so doing, that means that really the tenant is really paying $12 a square foot net. Okay? Does that make sense? Yes, no, possibly could be. Okay? Now, but if that's the case, we've kind of made that kind of an adjustment, then we also, by virtue of the stair stepping, then we may find, well, we're getting $12 in net, but then next year, we're also getting a $2 increase, so our new net is actually 14 bucks a square foot. Okay? My point with this, I'm not obviously trying to confuse you, not trying to make it more complicated than what it is. What I'm trying to get you to sort of see and to understand is there's a lot that goes into setting what these appropriate lease rates are, because if you set it poorly, you could very easily go bankrupt as the owner. Or vice versa, if you don't pay attention to what you're really signing as a prospective commercial tenant, you could go bankrupt as a tenant because you're getting charged a heck of a lot more than you thought you were being charged on the front end. You know, I mean, how would you like it, you know, that you go in and once again, you get a lease and they tell you, yeah, your lease is going to be 20 bucks a square foot, but then you find out, well, you're also going to have to pay all these additional overages and so forth, so on as a tenant, and therefore, you know, your real lease rate might be something like 30 or 40 bucks a square foot, and then you're just like, I can't afford that. You know, that's insane. Okay?
Usually works with.
I'm sorry?
Usually goes like this: $10 a square foot. Then you calculate that out. Then they say, okay, plus your 7% sales tax, plus your $250 CAM, and then you got a yearly CAM at the end. And the yearly CAM is whatever they say it is. So at the end of the day, you're at $10. They will do the math. You're at $18 plus at the end of the year. The CAM that they charge you, which you got $25, but you thought you were getting at least at $10 a square feet.
All right.
Can I just say something? I just don't understand why we're taking the $8 minus. Why don't we add that?
Well,
tenant.
In this particular case, what we're saying is the tenant is, in essence, we're going to give the tenant an $8 sort of allocation for expenses. And then we're going to be potentially anything above and beyond.
Because it's a gross lease and the...
Right, well, initially it was a gross lease. Now we're converting partially from a gross lease to a net lease.
Oh.
And what is that adjustment going to look like? In other words, the gross lease is always going to be, from the landlord's perspective, is always going to be a higher dollar amount because it includes everything. Okay? So the net lease is going to be a lower dollar amount, but the reality is that the tenant may end up obviously paying for a lot of the expenses or may have something baked into it to where they are responsible for, you know, a certain dollar amount of the expenses, and then above and beyond that, then, you know, well, I'm sorry, but you can have it set up either way. You can have it set up to where, in essence, the tenant is responsible for a certain dollar amount, and then, once again, above and beyond that, the property owner is responsible. You can also have it set up to where, once again, the property owner has sort of said, here is kind of the magical threshold. I am willing to pay expenses up to this amount, then you as the tenant are going to be responsible for pretty much everything above and beyond that. Okay? If you want to try to create some level of stability of income as the property owner. That's one of the reasons why you're going to try to do that. Okay? Now, percentage rents. So for retail tenants, and retail could more broadly kind of be defined if you don't, you know, most people when they think of retail, they're thinking almost exclusively as shops that they go in and they buy stuff, okay? But think about retail as a bit more broad, like for example, restaurants would be included in retail, okay? Or at least I would include restaurants in retail. And so what you may want to do as a property owner is you may want to come up with some sort of a scheme, and I use that word in a positive way, scheme, but you may want to come up with some sort of a scheme that would potentially be mutually beneficial to your retail tenant and to you as the owner of the property. And one of the ways that you could potentially achieve this is through some form of percentage rents, okay? Now, at one end of the spectrum, you could just simply say, all right, as let's say a restaurant or as a retailer, you just simply pay me a certain percentage of your gross sales each month in rent. And you set that percentage, okay? What do you think about that? Anybody?
I think it's a sweet deal. I actually worked on a project in Boca Raton where we controlled the tenant mix to enhance the walkability of the mixed use development, and so that the tenants would maximize their potentials for sale. So it was a good deal for us because we got a percentage of their earnings.
Okay.
Over a certain amount.
Sure. Okay, and we're going to talk about that in terms of like a base level. Okay, but any just general thoughts or comments on the whole idea of percentage rent for like retail restaurant tenants? Anybody?
Wouldn't that be bad right now?
I'm sorry? Would that be bad right now? Absolutely, it would be very bad right now. But then again, if you sort of back away from that, if you have the fixed cost of paying rent, that's also really bad right now from the tenant's perspective. Because they probably can't pay their lease because they simply aren't generating any income. But excellent point. I would totally 100% agree. Okay, Jim, you had a comment?
I was saying most of the big box stores, Neiman Marcus, Macy's, that's why they're going out of business right now, because there are those type of leases where they're selling more money, they're making more money over the internet than the leases are bringing back to them.
Yep, no, I think that's very probable as well. Because usually what will happen in a percentage rent environment, it doesn't always take the form of, okay, just pay me a flat amount of your gross sales, period, and then there's no base. Normally, there's a base rent that you would start with, and then above and beyond that, you simply would pay me a percentage of your sales or net sales or tax receipts or whatever. But one interesting sort of real life example, because he actually came into class once and was telling us all about this. So how many of you are familiar with the, I just went blank on the name of the restaurant, over on the beach, the Italian restaurant, Casablanca, okay? How many of you are familiar with that restaurant, okay? It's an Italian restaurant over there on the beach. Okay, the owner of that property, Steve Holmos, came into our class once and as a speaker, and he was telling us that with them, the lease that he did was, and it makes all the sense in the world, was, hey, guys, I'm going to charge you 7% of gross sales. That's it. So every month, you're going to basically open up your sort of, receipts and say, okay, you've got $100,000 of sales this month. I get 7% of that, so I walk away with $7,000 in rent. Does that make sense? Okay, what do you think about that arrangement?
Depends how much it trusts the restaurant owner.
I'm sorry?
It depends how much it trusts the restaurant owner to give him the correct numbers.
Yeah, no, and I would argue that that is a problem with some restaurants where obviously it could be a lot of cash transactions and you really do question whether or not there's some funny business going on. But and actually, I mean, not to get off too much on the story, but there was a restaurant in Fort Worth, Texas, that and it still is this way. Basically, and I'm not going to suggest anything too much, but you could only pay cash, and it was like one of the most popular restaurants in the city, and no credit cards were accepted. No checks, only cash. And you're saying, well, how do you do that? Well, basically, where you check out, they have an ATM machine that charges you like $5 per transaction, so they make money off of that as well. But nonetheless, but the point being, and you have to, of course, immediately where my head goes is, well, the reason they're doing this is they're, in essence, trying to not pay as much in sales taxes and income tax as they potentially might have to, and possibly some money laundering, sort of stuff going on there. But my point is that, yeah, I mean, I would agree with your comment that, yeah, you do have to have some level of trust with the, you know, a retail tenant, but also you have to kind of think that in terms of sales tax receipts and things like that, that if you're cheating the government, you've got a bigger problem to a certain extent on the horizon than just, you know, cheating basically your landlord out of, you know, a few dollars. Plus, you know, you can probably, you know, go in and get a pretty good idea if, you know, you sit there for one night as the owner of the property and get an idea of what the receipts are coming in and be able to kind of extrapolate and sort of say, okay, yeah, you know, we're within you know, a couple of $1,000s or whatever on gross receipts, but I'm not overly concerned about it. But my point, I'm not trying to get too belabored in this, but it, as a concept, think about what that does to both the property owner and to the tenant. What kind of incentives does that give, in essence, both sides? Like, for example, let's say that I'm the owner, you know, and I'm charging them, let's say, 7% of gross sales. What incentive do I have? I, as the owner of the property, not of the restaurant, I'm going to be going out, I'm going to be telling everybody in town, every single one of my friends and family, hey, go eat at the restaurant, you know, because ultimately, some of that money is going to come back to me in terms of income. You know, does that make sense? Okay? Or 7% of every dollar, you know, that you spend there is coming back to me. You know, but it also, what other incentives is it going to give me? It's going to give me incentive to probably keep the property pretty well maintained. All right? Then, you know, if something happens on the property, something breaks, something needs to be replaced or repaired, I'm probably going to be a lot more on the spot of running there and literally fixing whatever's wrong than, you know, the normal sort of, you know, relationship of, okay, you owe me, you know, $5,000 a month. Oh, the air conditioning broke. Okay, we'll take care of that next week. You know, or we'll deal with that whenever we can get to it. You know, and that difference, you know, I think is a significant one to think about. You know, and what kind of relationship that you want to have with your tenant. Now, clearly, you know, that sort of thing is not going to work quite so well with other types of tenants, especially like maybe office tenants. I mean, I suppose you could, you know, do, like if you had a law firm, you could say, okay, billable hours or something like that, but you know, it's going to be a lot less likely. It's going to be almost always, you know, on the idea of some sort of retail or sort of restaurant tenant that you're going to have this sort of percentage rent. Okay, question, somebody? No? Okay, I thought somebody was trying to ask a question. Okay, so let's take a look at this. So as we said, it could be a situation of like, all right, you've got $100,000 of sales in the month, and we simply get a percentage of that, like 7%. So that would mean we would get $7,000 in rent. Okay? Okay, so that's one example, the simple one that I gave. Now, we could also have a situation of where we have a base rent of, let's say, $10 per square foot per year, and let's say that we've got 10,000 square feet of space. And then we say, all right, you've got percentage rent of, let's say, actually we can still do it as a percentage. Let's say percentage rent of 7% of gross sales above $50,000 a month. Okay? All right, so here's all the information you need. How much would this tenant be paying in rent, both on an absolute dollar basis per month and on a per square foot amount each month. So let's just sort of start here. We've got the 10,000 square feet times $10 a square foot. So it's $100,000.
A year?
Yes, that's just the base rent. It just happens to be the same as the sales, but it's okay. So $100,000, this is our base rent. Okay? And then our percentage rent, we said it's going to be 7% above the gross sales. Well, I didn't mean for it to work out like this, but obviously our gross sales happens to be $100,000 as well. But what we're saying in this case is that the percentage rent is only going to be based on the amount above $50,000. So what that means is only $50,000 is going to be subject to that percentage rent of the 7%, which is going to be $3,500. Does that make sense? Yes or no? Okay, so your total rent, if you want to sort of think about it, is if every month you're paying $3,500, so 3,500 times 12, that's $42,000 a year in percentage rent. Because we were saying this is monthly.
And it was over 50,000, so the first 50 basically falls out, right?
Correct.
That's why we did times 50.
Right. So in other words, basically what you're sort of saying, here's another way to look at this. Pretty much what you're saying is that the base rent is really being kind of applied to that first $50,000 of sales. Would be another way to kind of look at it. But it's just a way to ensure, from the property owner's perspective, at least you're getting something, okay? But we're still incentivizing things that obviously if sales go above that, that we're still incentivized, okay? And so in this case, we're adding an extra $42,000 to the annual base rent, so your total rent, $142,000 for the year. So, if you want to express it that way, that's fine, depending on what I ask. Or you could say, okay, well, divided by 10,000 square feet, then that would be $14.20 per square foot per year, okay? Or another way of expressing it would just simply be 142,000 divided by 12. So your monthly rent, if you want to just look at it as a dollar amount, out of pocket, would be $11,833.33. Okay? So my point is it can be expressed a lot of different ways. Okay? And it just sort of depends on what it is you're trying to kind of accomplish. I mean, are we looking at dollars in terms of raw dollars? Are we looking at sort of monthly dollars? Are we looking at a price or a dollar amount per square foot that we can then compare to maybe other properties? So it's just a question of kind of what is it that we're sort of looking for? What are we sort of asking for? Okay? Does that make sense, everybody? Okay. Now.
I'm sorry, I have a question.
Yep.
But the percentage rent I mean, that will change, that could change.
Yes, and you know, in this example, just to keep it simple, we just made the assumption that your sales are $100,000 a month all year long, okay? But in practice, yes, every single month your sales are going to be different. Therefore, you know, based on seasonal variation, based on just, you know, other factors, you know, that number's going to go up and down. But at least from the property owner's perspective, they can sort of rest assured at least they're getting the base rent, you know, as a consistent amount each month, and then, you know, look at the percentage rent as, you know, an overage or as, you know, a bonus or, you know, however they want to, okay? But I mean, you know, the reality is you're only bounded by your creativity here, okay? And what you know, between a landlord and between a tenant as to what you can come to an agreement on, what works for both of you, okay? And, you know, we talked about some of the kind of issues that you have to certainly be aware of, that as an owner, yeah, you want to make sure that the tenant is actually paying you what they're supposed to be paying you under their percentage rent allocation, you know, and they're not lying to you about how much money they're actually earning. But, you know, barring that, you know, for the most part, this is not a bad arrangement to typically have, you know, between a landlord and a tenant. Because when you think about right now, as someone mentioned, you know, under COVID, who really benefits here? If you had an extreme, you know, like, for example, a restaurant, you know, we're saying they're paying a flat 7%. Well, they have no sales. They're not paying any rent. Now, clearly they still have other costs they've got to, you know, take care of. They still, I'm sure, have a base level of utilities and base level of staff, a base level of other operational costs, but at least, you know, the big expense of, you know, rent is not one that they necessarily, you know, have to incur. And this is also kind of another interesting little side lesson on this, that for retail tenants, there is some wisdom to the 7% thing. I guess that's what I'm getting at. For most retail tenants, as a general rule of thumb, you would pay between 7 to 10% maximum in rent relative to your gross sales, okay? So that in and of itself is kind of like, woo, okay, that makes sense. Now, why 7%? Because I mean, if you think about it, your retail business, like, you know, it doesn't really matter what that retail business is, if you're paying more than 10% of your gross sales in rent, or the amount of money that you are, you know, paying for the building that you're occupying, chances are you're paying too much, okay? And that your business is not probably going to be successful, you know, as a general rule, okay? Always exceptions to the rule, but as a general rule, probably not going to be overly successful, okay?
Hey, sir?
Yep.
How do you verify landlord collection?
Well, the only real way that you have to verify is through sales tax receipts. Because as I was saying earlier, that, you know, if you're lying to the government about what you're collecting, you know, you've got much bigger problems than just simply lying to me as the landlord. So in most instances, that's what's going to be looked at, are sales tax receipts that you have to file every single month. And, you know, and as I also said, that, you know, another way to verify is, you know, potentially, you know, literally go to the restaurant, go to the store, and kind of, you know, sit around for an entire day, a normal day, and get a sense for what the sales are and see whether or not it's within, you know, the sense of normality. And in many cases...
In a restaurant, you have the POS systems.
I'm sorry?
That everything, in a restaurant today, everything runs through a POS system, and you can access that if the restaurant owner allows you to access.
Oh, sure. Yeah, no. The point of sale system, yes. That, you know, and that's the case even with a traditional retailer, that if the owner of the business allows you access to their point of sale system, in other words, where they're entering every transaction, you know, and you can access that remotely, then as the property owner, then, you know, there you go. You know, that's yet another way to kind of ensure that, yeah, you're being paid what you're supposed to be paid. You know, I mean, it's a little bit more invasive, but yet, you know, once again, you know, it's a question of, think about it like this. you tell a tenant, and I'm not trying to belabor this too much, but you tell a tenant that here's your choice. You can either pay me 7% of your gross receipts, or you can pay me 10%, or what I'm sort of viewing as basically 10% of what your gross receipts are, and then that's just going to be your base rent. You follow kind of what I'm saying? You know, kind of a predictive, you know, sort of thing of the equivalent of 10%. So it's kind of like, you would think that most tenants would say, okay, for that 3% differential in rent, I'm willing to open up my books and show you, you know, what's there, you know, what do I really have to hide? You follow? Okay. Yep.
For the base rent of 142, why did you divide that by 12? Shouldn't it be multiplied by 12?
Okay. Which one, I'm sorry?
42,000 divided by 12 to get the 11,833.
No, I think 142,000, which was the total annual rent, I'm sorry. Yes, total annual rent for the property. In other words, you've got 10,000 square feet, $10 per square foot per year, so your total base rent is 100,000 per year. The 42,000 is basically your percentage rent, which is equivalent to 3,500 a month times 12 or 42,000. So adding together the 100,000 base rent plus the 42,000 percentage rent gives you 142,000 total rent. And all we were saying there is that that equates to basically $11,833 a month out of pocket for the tenant. Or another way of looking at it, if you divide it by the square footage, that's the equivalent of $14.20 a square foot per year for the space that they're occupying. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that I was confused. I thought the base rent was monthly. That's yearly.
Gotcha. Okay. And that's one of the things that, you know, obviously we constantly are going back and forth sometimes between monthly numbers and annual numbers, and that's, you know, just one of those things that we just, I mean, you know, all of us at times are going to get a little muddled on that, but yeah, just make sure that, yeah, you're trying to focus on that. Okay, moving forward. Okay, one of the things that we already sort of talked about are these common area maintenance charges. We've talked about them sort of conceptually, but let's also kind of look at, all right, that we've got a property, and let's say that within this property, we've got, I don't know, let's say we've got a tenant here, tenant 1, tenant 2, 3, and then tenant 4 we'll sort of say is more of an anchor tenant, okay? And don't get hung up on the sizes of the boxes there, but let's just sort of conceptually, let's say that on an annual basis, we start looking at these CAM charges, and for this particular property, let's say that overall, we've got CAM charges for the property as a whole of $100,000. All right? The question is, well, how do we go about allocating that $100,000 to the individual tenants? And, you know, and now, we talked about earlier, you know, some of the different things that CAM charges could be used for. You know, on a regular, normal, operating basis, you know, the CAM charges could include utilities for all of the sort of the common space. In other words, like if this is a retail store or retail property, strip center kind of thing, then, you know, out here, you know, you've got all your parking, and you've got lighting within the parking that you obviously have to pay for. You've got landscaping, and so forth, so on, that, you know, someone has to pay for. And that, you know, to a certain extent, would be one of the things that the CAM charges are going to cover. Now, the question is, all right, well, how do you go about allocating it to the individual tenants? So it could be done in a variety of ways. One way is that maybe your anchor tenant, assuming tenant number 4 is kind of your anchor tenant here for a second. And all an anchor tenant means is it's the big tenant, okay? It's the one that sort of holds down the space, so to speak. And you know, a typical anchor tenant in a strip center is going to be like a grocery store, or you know, some other sort of significant big box tenant that you know, kind of has the dominant sort of space within the center. Okay, nothing really unusual about that, except that usually the anchor tenant is a national tenant, okay? Whereas maybe these sort of inline tenants, like tenants 1, 2, and 3, might be local, you know, or maybe a combination of local and regional, whatever it might be. But with the anchor tenant, usually it's going to be the case they're going to pay less per square foot in rent than the inline tenants do, and they may have certain provisions with respect to common area maintenance that limits their exposure, okay? That it could very well be that, you know, and once again, I didn't draw this to scale, but roughly kind of looking at it, you're basically saying 50% of the center is the anchor tenant, and the other 50% are the inline tenants, okay? Roughly, okay? Let's just say. And if that's the case, you know, you could say, well, okay, they're going to pay based on their percentage occupancy. So if that were the case, you would sort of say, well, the anchor should have to pay half. Okay? If they're occupying half the space, they should have to pay half. But before you write that down, which I saw that most of you did, which is okay, the reality is they may have a provision that says, no, even though we occupy 50% of the space, we, as an anchor tenant, only want to have to pay maybe 40% of the common area maintenance charges each year. Okay? So in this case, 40% of 100,000 would be $40,000. Okay, does that make sense? Okay? We could keep it a fixed amount, we could make it a percentage, you know, but the point is that is a point of negotiation, okay, between basically the owner and the anchor tenant. And the idea, you're sort of saying, well, why are we doing that? Well, it's kind of an economies of scale thing, but it's also, we want the anchor tenant, especially the anchor tenant, to be successful because they are the ones driving traffic to the center. They are the ones that we, you know, as an owner, as an investor, you know, we're sort of looking at as a Class A or certainly high quality, I'm trying to think of the exact word to use, so it's not coming to me, credit tenant is what I'm trying to think of. A very high credit tenant that in essence we want to make happy, we want to keep happy. And so that's why we're sort of willing to give away a little, you know, and put a little bit more of a burden on those inline tenants. Does that make sense, everybody? Yes or no? Okay, so if that's the case, the anchor is paying 40, then that means the inline tenants are going to pay 60,000 total, but there's 3 of them, 3 anchor tenants, so each of them is going to pay 20,000 bucks off of the CAM charges. Does that make sense, everybody? Yes or no? Okay.
And that's annual, right?
Correct. I mean, it could be monthly, but you know, we said it was annual. Okay. All right. Okay. Any questions about that? Good to go? Okay. Moving forward.
We could also do that because they're paying for all the commercial, the advertisement, the marketing, driving everybody to.
Absolutely. That's absolutely another good point to make is that usually that national tenant, you know, they've got marketing dollars that may be coming from a corporate office, but also they've got, you know, that ability to potentially be more heavily promoted to actually, once again, drive the traffic to the center. And then obviously the inline tenants benefit. Okay? Good point.
Can I ask you a question?
Yep.
So, when we ask you about a property, say that has like a center and then maybe some out parcels on the outside, usually do those leases function completely differently than the ones who are in the center?
They absolutely can, but they don't necessarily have to. You know, and I'm not trying to be evasive whenever I say that. It literally is totally dependent.
It's always different.
Yeah, I mean, and every property owner, every tenant, you know, they kind of have their own headspace as, you know, what works for them, what doesn't work for them, and what they believe to be a great strategy or, you know, the best way of doing things. But the reality is, you know, think of it, I mean, put yourself in the context, I don't know, we're in the middle of Nebraska or something like that, and you've got some guy or gal that owns, you know, this big shopping center, and maybe they own it outright, you know, whatever, and, you know, it's the only center in town, and the national tenants want to be there because, you know, they want to be able to service the population, and they might be willing to make concessions with this person that they ordinarily wouldn't make, because it's kind of like it's the only game in town and it would be almost too difficult to do something on their own, and so the arrangement that they might have there might be totally, completely different than they would have somewhere else. You know, and I have seen that over and over again of just weird, random kind of arrangements of where, you know, national tenants, because of some unique local flavor of how things are done, you know, it's different, you know. So I don't know whether that answers your question or not, but from my perspective, it's just there are no absolutes, I guess is what I'm trying to say, in terms of how you might structure it. Okay? All right. Other questions, comments? Okay, so one of the things that from the property owner and the tenant's perspective that you want to also think about are tenant improvements, also just abbreviated TIs, okay? And tenant improvements are the things that obviously the tenant brings into the property, okay, to make it their own in some way, all right? The question, or multiple questions about TIs that you want to sort of think about is, once the tenant does the TI, if they pay for it, is it theirs? Or does the property owner get to keep it? Some cases yes, some cases no, okay? But for the most part, typically, those sort of fixtures, those items that they put in, you know, whether it's cabinets or walls or, you know, ceilings or lighting or whatever it is, the property owner, you know, after that lease is up, potentially gets to keep all of that, you know. Now, in some cases, you don't want to keep all of that stuff, okay, because it may not be useful at all for the next tenant, okay. Like, for example, let's say, once again, we're dealing with a little strip center and a little retail center, and we've got like a hair salon, okay, and, or, you know, barber shop or whatever you want to call it, okay. They go in, they have to put in an excessive amount of plumbing and an excessive amount of you know, electrical outlets and mirrors and lights and whatever else, you know, for that space to make it ready for a hairstylist, barber, whatever you want to call it. And so let's say that tenant goes bankrupt or they move out. Owner is stuck to a certain extent with this property with all of these fixtures in there, and you know, one property owner might look at it and say, woohoo, you know, now I've got an opportunity to be able to lease out to another barbershop or another hair salon, and they don't have to do very much tenant improvements, and so, you know, it's a make-ready space, it's done. But another property owner might say, hey, there are way too many barbershops, way too many hairstyle salons in this town, in this location, so I'm going to have to now spend several thousands of dollars going in and basically ripping out all of that stuff to make the space usable again for a future tenant. Does that make sense? So my point with that, and this is especially true in like retail or traditional mall spaces, many of those property owners will say you return the space as white space. You rent it as white space in the sense that you are renting nothing more than basically 4 walls, maybe a ceiling, and a base floor, okay? And so any improvements, any changes to any of that you've done, you must remove it at your cost as the tenant before you move out and return the space to that white space. Does that make sense? Okay? But, you know, as I said, other property owners, you know, are like, you know, some of these things that are left behind could be of value and once again, could make the space that much more, you know, interesting to a prospective tenant. So it's just, once again, this is, you gotta know all the circumstances of like, it depends, okay? Okay, so any thoughts about that? I don't want to just like say all that and then not give you a chance to sort of chime in on it. Anybody?
Somebody's going bankrupt, it's not going to help you to tell him that that you need the white space.
True. And it may be difficult to get them to make those, you know, obviously to do those demolition items prior to, once again, especially if they are going bankrupt or are bankrupt. Okay. Anybody else? Other questions, thoughts? Okay, now, what I haven't talked about as it relates to tenant improvements is who pays for them? Okay? The general assumption from what we just talked about was the tenant pays for them. Okay? But in other words, you know, tenant comes into a shopping center, tenant comes into an office building, tenant comes into whatever property that, you know, is just basically white space, and, you know, you automatically sort of make the assumption, okay, I'm renting the space as a tenant, so I'm going to turn it into whatever I, you know, desire, so it's at my expense to do all of that. Well, that's not always the case. In some cases, and actually in many cases, that isn't the case. What may happen is you have a property owner that says, I'm willing to kind of partner with you on this a little bit and give you a tenant finish out allowance of maybe a certain dollar amount or a certain dollar amount per square foot. And as long as you stick within that sort of budget, then you're not going to have to pay anything as a tenant. Now, if you go over that budget, then you as a tenant are going to have to pick up the cost. Now, ultimately, let's be real. At the end of the day, the tenant is really still the one paying. It's just that the owner is saying it may be easier for us to get a tenant if we offer some of these sort of tenant finish out allowances up front. And so this is where it evolves or it changes over time depending on what the market is actually doing. So if you're in a really, really, really lousy market in terms of tons of space available for lease, you're going to probably have more property owners kind of stepping up to the plate and saying, hey, we want you as a tenant. And to show how much we want you as a tenant, we're going to pay for a good portion, if not all, of your sort of tenant finish out. But in exchange, we maybe want a longer term lease, and we want, you know, obviously a little bit of, you know, more money as a lease rate to basically compensate us as the property owner for having done those tenant improvements. But also in the back of the owner's mind, They're saying, hey, these improvements that they're making, we're going to potentially get to sign off on them in the sense of approve them. So we may want to make them as generic as possible so that a future tenant could take advantage of them as well. Okay, so there's a lot of different things going on there, you know, kind of behind the scenes as to how the decision is made of, you know, does the property owner pay for these? Does the tenant pay for these up front? Is it some sort of an arrangement where, in essence, the owner is kind of quasi-financing these? You know, and there's a lot of different, you know, things going on there. Now, one of the things that may be taking place in the background is if the property owner does choose to finance these improvements, obviously if they're, you know, really rock solid financially, yeah, they just dole out the money, you know, pay for whatever these improvements are, they're done, over, move on. But in many cases, what will actually take place is that once a lease is executed between the tenant and the property owner will take that executed lease to a lender and say, hey, lender, give me money to basically come in, do these sort of tenant improvements on the property, and then we've got obviously this tenant backing up that lease to be able to demonstrate that we're going to be able to pay. Okay? Does that make sense? Yes? No? Possibly could be. Okay. Moving forward. So, let's say that we've got a property and we've got $20 per square foot per year as the rental rate. And let's say that it's a 10,000 square foot property. So over the course of the year, once again, 20,000, I'm sorry, 2,000 times 10,000 would be 200,000. Okay? But let's say that we offer an allowance, a tenant sort of improvement allowance as the owner of the property of $5 a square foot, okay, for the first year, all right, for the tenant. So if we offered $5 per square foot for year one, then that's going to work out to be $50,000 of a basically TI allowance. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay? So, we're going to sort of front that cost as the property owner in whatever way we choose to sort of front it, but in other words, that's what we're going to allow for in that first year. So what may happen, kind of from a cash flow perspective, is we as the property owner may spend that $50,000 cash money, build out the space to the requirements of the tenant, and then they, you know, obviously then pay us the $200,000 that they, or, well, they would actually not pay us $200,000, they would only pay us $150,000 over the course of the year because we gave them that allowance. Okay, so what would we actually, I mean, ultimately, they're going to pay. Okay, they're going to pay us $200,000. We're going to obviously pay the $150,000. So that leaves us with $150,000 that we're actually receiving as the property owner after everything has been paid for. So what does that then equate to in terms of rental per square foot per year? We would just simply take now, divide that by the square footage, and that would mean $15 per square foot per year for year 1 is going to be the lease rate, effectively. Or how much we're actually receiving. Does that make sense? Okay, but then every subsequent year, we're going to be receiving the $200,000. Okay, so this is one way to structure it. Okay, everybody cool with that? Drink.
Professor, can you scroll up just for a quick second?
Okay. All right, do we need a break or are we good?
Question, that tenant allowance is also just for the first year, correct?
Correct.
How do you usually see that structured? Is that one of those things also that just depends on what the tenant wants to do and the landlord wants to do?
Yep. I mean, in some cases, it will be the tenant goes out, spends all the money, and then, in essence, is basically just deducting it off of the rent. Okay? In other instances, it's the property owner spending the money, and then ultimately, they're just basically receiving $50,000 less than they would have been receiving. Okay? I mean, usually where this gets really dicey is with restaurants, because with restaurants, there's a lot, obviously, of upfront costs that going, all the equipment, all the furniture, the kitchen equipment that literally, you've got vent hoods, you've got all this other stuff potentially that cost a lot of money to install, and grease traps, and God only knows what else that you may have to provide. And so once you've, in many cases, have made a space that's once you have made a rental retail space into a restaurant, say that 5 times fast, then it's very challenging and sometimes very counterproductive to almost turn it into anything else, because you spent all this money and effort doing that, so it ends up, in most instances, being a restaurant from that point forward. Okay, does that make sense?
They need these restaurants for the centers.
I'm sorry?
But they need these restaurants.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. I'm not arguing that they don't need them, but it's just, speaking as a property owner and as a landlord, the tenants that can sometimes make you the happiest and also make you the saddest are restaurants, because some of these can cost so much money to open up in terms of the tenant finish out and everything else that goes into it, and then they open up and it's a total flop, and you're like, oh my God, what do I do now? Well, then you try to convert it, maybe into another restaurant that also may be a total flop. And you sort of, at some point, you kind of begin to say, okay, well, maybe this space just isn't meant to be a restaurant for whatever reasons, and, bite the expense and put in something else. So it's, restaurants are just, it's obviously a very, very tricky business. And, in terms of being able to find ones that are obviously able to maintain themselves for long periods of time. So.
Ask the landlord to remove a restaurant.
Okay, Jim, you're kind of, you're not very loud. What are you saying?
I said to remove a restaurant from your retail space is quite expensive.
Yes, it is. And that's why I'm saying that, sometimes you're almost sort of stuck with it once it's that use. Most other retail uses are pretty non-invasive, with the exception of, like I said, kind of a hair salon sort of thing. But most retail tenants, you think about it, all they're really doing is putting up some shelving and maybe a little bit of lighting and doing some interior decorating of sorts, and boom, they're open. It's not that big of a deal, and to shut down, they could be out literally that same day. That's very, very different than obviously one where you're going to have to be putting in all this extra sort of infrastructure. Okay, Julia?
What about at the end, like, I know my family owns a lot of commercial property, and like dry cleaners, my family won't allow dry cleaners to rent from them because of the chemicals that leak into the land, as well as gas stations. Do you see a lot of, like, I don't know what that would be called, but like,
tenant or property owners that will not allow certain uses?
or like they add on certain costs because maybe they get charged at the end?
Absolutely, absolutely. Because, and you identified a couple of really good ones. Dry cleaners, yeah, the chemicals that they use in dry cleaning are notoriously bad, for the environment, and especially some of the old school dry cleaners, they're flushing all kinds of stuff down the sewer that, it just isn't good. Let's just put it that way, in a very simple way. And, with gas stations, with underground, storage tanks, for many years, those storage tanks were, made out of steel or metal, and over time they would rust, in the ground and then start leaking into the surrounding, land, and then ultimately into the groundwater, and causing all sorts of environmental contamination, and then the cost to remove those tanks and remediate the land and everything else, huge cost associated with that. And so, now most of the newer sort of gas stations, you'll notice, the tanks are not metal. They're, more like a, not necessarily plastic, but some, form of a plastic-esque sort of material that, is going to be much less likely to rupture. So, Julia, I'm sorry, you got another comment or question? Okay. All right, moving forward. All right, so one of the things that you personally may be familiar with, just based on, having rented an apartment or rented a house or that sort of thing, is a rent abatement, which is basically free rent for some period of time. Well, commercial properties are not exempt to this, concept. I mean, they do it all the time as well. Because, think about it. If you own a retail space and you've got several dark spaces in your retail building or facility or whatever you want to call it, that's not good for business. Because instantly, like, let's just say you've got a 5-tenant retail strip and you've got 2 active tenants but 3 dark spaces. How's that going to look to the average ordinary person? 1 dark space, we can kind of maybe, ignore a little bit. But, if you've got 3 dark spaces, everybody's going to be looking at, oh, that's a bad center. Don't want to go there, to the existing tenants because it must be a bad center. It's like all the kind of psychological stuff that goes on inside people's heads. I mean, how many times have you gone to a mall and, and they have done everything in their power to try to disguise the dark space? They've put up murals, they've put up, all kinds of artwork is usually the big one, but, in general, trying to hide the fact that it's empty, okay? Because the perception is it's negative. And so, coming back to the discussion on rent abatement, that in many cases for retail tenants or retail strip center owners or retail owners, they may say, hey, we're more than happy to work out some sort of a deal where we'll do a rent abatement for, a few months, could be a couple of months, could be 6 months, usually probably not longer than 6 months, and we will do that because we want you as a tenant and we want to get the space filled as quickly as possible, and so forth, so on. Another thing that you'll sort of see in addition to kind of rent abatements, or you you've probably seen, are these quote-unquote pop-up spaces. You know, where you'll have some sort of like a pop-up restaurant, you know, it more be excuse me, more like almost like a food truck-ish kind of thing, or a pop-up retailer of some sort, and you know, meant to be temporary tenants to kind of quasi-occupy the space until you can get more permanent tenants that, you know, hopefully will be, you know, that much more viable. So, but getting back to the abatement thing, so what if we have a situation of where the normal monthly rent is $20,000 a month, and that would ordinarily be for 12 months a year. Or $240,000, all right? And let's just say that this is for, let's say we've got 15,000 square feet of space. All right? So in one sense, we could sort of say, okay, well, if we divide that out by 15,000 square feet, so 240,000 divided by 15,000 square feet works out to be $16 per square foot per year. Okay? Everybody good up to this point? Okay, we've pretty much done stuff like that already today. Now, the rent abatement. All right, so how many months free rent do we want to give? How much?
Three.
Okay, let's split the difference, 4.5. All right, so 4.5 months of free rent. All right, so in that case, we can kind of say, all right, if we've got 20.
Rent there.
Well, I'm sorry, what?
I want to rent there.
Yeah, 4.5 months. All right, so $20,000 a month, 4.5 months free. So 20,000 times 4.5 be 90 grand of free rent. So the question might be, okay, if that's the case, we would subtract that out, all right, and what does that leave us with? So 240,000 minus 90,000, oops, 150,000. So 150,000 divided by 15,000 square feet means that our new sort of effective rental rate is $10 per square foot per year for that first year. Now, this also gets into how do we give away that rent, okay? And this is where, once again, it potentially gets kind of, you know, tricky or unusual between one property owner and one set of tenants and then another. In some cases, you know, it is simply, okay, for the first 4.5 months, you as a tenant are not going to cut a check to the property owner. And in some cases, part of the reason for doing that rent abatement, and under those circumstances, and with that kind of arrangement, might be that is a way for the property owner to allow the tenant to basically self-fund their own tenant improvements. Does that make sense? But in other words, that is indirectly, you know, it could be, you know, I'm sort of giving you the choice of basically coming, you know, occupy my space and pay a certain rental level, but I could just simply say, all right, I as the property owner am willing to abate your rent, so basically give you free rent for the first 4.5 months, but you're going to spend that first 4.5 months getting your space ready, getting all the improvements done that you want to have done to the property, and using that, in essence, free rent period to accomplish that. That might be one approach. But it also could just be that, once again, I'm just giving you free rent just from the standpoint of just wanting to get somebody into the space. But then there's also kind of yet a third approach, which would be more of just simply amortizing that free rent over the entire year, which is kind of what we've done here by saying, all right, if we're giving away $90,000 of free rent, the reality is the tenant is really only paying $150,000 for the year, or their rental rate has been reduced from $16 a square foot to $10 a square foot for that first year. Well, what that may, then translate to in terms of a monthly cost, if this is our new annual cost of $150,000, and we were to basically divide by 12, I keep turning my calculator all over. All right, 150,000 divided by 12. So 12,500 a month would be the lease rate that we are, the abated sort of lease rate, versus $20,000 a month. So in other words, I guess what I'm trying to say is that we as the property owner may not want to forego the actual cash money for that first 4.5 months, but instead just say, hey, for the first year of your lease, you're getting the equivalent of 4.5 months worth of rent, basically forgiven, abated, whatever word you want to sort of throw in there. Does that make sense? Okay. And once again, you on your own, I mean, I know I certainly have, the years, renting different places that, you'd have a situation of where they'd say, okay, the first month is free, or the first 2 months are free, or whatever it might be, all to, once again, try to get their occupancy, or keep their occupancy as high as possible. Okay? All right? Comments, thoughts, observations?
Let me ask you a question. So if I'm looking at buying a property and I ask for the rent rolls to prove that that property was making a particular NOI, even though you give out these concessions like this to as far as free rent is concerned, just to maintain the monthly or the annual rent. If I get the rent rolls, won't I really know what the true NOI is, as opposed to what the state?
But yeah, absolutely you will. But sometimes, depending on, and in no way, shape, form, or fashion am I advocating any of this, but from an accounting perspective, there are multiple ways of how you can sort of realize income, and when you realize that income, and how that potentially flows through in terms of the operating statements. So for example, let's say that I'm giving you the operating statement for the property. It's an annual operating statement. And I sort of say, okay, look, we're operating at virtually 100% occupancy, but the reason we're operating at virtually 100% occupancy is, yeah, I had to give away all this free rent up front, but, if you look at the, let's say the current month's rental income, it's really high, but what that doesn't necessarily reflect is, yeah, we gave away 3 or 4 or 4.5 months worth of free rent, and that's the only reason we sort of have those tenants, because they got that discounted rent up front, but yet at the end of the year, you know, assuming all that happened in like January, February, March kind of thing, but at the end of the year, we look like we're, you know, home run in terms of the income the property is generating on a monthly basis. Does that make sense?
Yes, but should we base our analysis as investors on the 16th or the 10th?
Realistically, it's a question of how long-term the leases are. If the leases are long-term, meaning let's say 5, 10 years, a few months up front is really just kind of a drop in the bucket on things. But if we're talking about like a residential lease, it's only a year in duration, giving away 4.5 months of free rent would be, you know, just, it wouldn't make any sense at all. And that would destroy, you know, kind of the value of the property, because you're sort of like saying, okay, yeah, we have to give away 4.5 months of rent this year, or we have to give away another 4.5 months next year, you know, and so the question is, you know, whether it's stabilized sort of income, or this is like a one-shot kind of fixes the occupancy issue to be able to, you know, move us forward. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Professor, aside from like given market conditions, is this a relatively common
Is it relatively I'm sorry, Alex, you sort of cut out. Is it relatively common? I'm sorry.
So aside from like given market conditions right now during the pandemic, is this like a typical strategy to try and get new tenants?
Absolutely. I mean, the largest users of this, without question, are apartment communities. Okay, without question. I mean, and what happens is, very simply, you probably have an oversupply of product, and maybe you as the owner of the property are sort of saying, hey, the real, what's the word I'm looking for, peak period of demand for residential housing maybe is in August, okay? And we're now sitting at the beginning of June, and we're saying our property is half full. We don't want to wait around until August to get, you know, new tenants. So to make us more competitive than the other folks that are in the market, knowing there's fewer people looking right now, we're going to offer up free rent for a month or two and get people in immediately. I mean, that's usually the kind of the strategy on the residential side. On the commercial side, yet again, I mean, it's so absolutely unique in the sets of circumstances that can exist there of, you know, what are you trying to accomplish? Well, okay, here's one thing that, you know, I haven't talked about. You may actually have certain provisions in your loan documentation as a property owner that you say to your lender, whenever you get your financing on the property, must maintain 75% occupancy. If you don't maintain that 75% occupancy, all of a sudden, even though you're still paying the bills, you could be in what is referred to as technical default, okay? And technical default can trigger some very unpleasant reactions by your lender. And basically those unpleasant reactions could be them getting much more up into your business about how you're running and operating the property. And they could say, okay, since you're in technical default, you drop below 75% occupancy in this property, we now want from you, as a result of that technical default, we now want monthly operating statements on the property. We now want you to consult with us before you initiate any new leases on the property. We now want you to, in essence, come to us for any expenditures over $5,000. We must approve. You know, I mean, so there's all kinds of things that may be triggered by just a simple reduction in the occupancy level. Okay, does that make sense? So there's, and I guess what I'm trying to say with that is there are other things that may be playing into your decision to offer free rent because you're trying to basically stave off another issue, okay? And that issue being the lender getting more up in your business.
Technical default was a good example, for sure.
Okay? All right, other questions, comments, observations? Okay? I can tell you're getting a little bit restless out there in terms of the body language and the movement. We're close. If you need to take a break, obviously feel free. I'm going to try to go ahead and keep going, and we don't have that much left to get through. Okay. So one of the topics that we're going to be exploring more later in this semester are what are referred to as CapEx, or capital expenditures. Now, capital expenditures are different, and we're going to get into all of this later, different from repairs and maintenance, okay, on a property. Capital expenditures tend to be big things, things that last a long time, improvements to the property, whereas repairs and maintenance typically revolve around just doing that, maintaining the property at a certain level, okay, of operations. And so, one of the things that we're going to be getting into is why we care as to whether or not something is classified as a capital expenditure versus a repair and maintenance. Repairs and maintenance are treated as operating expenses, okay? Whereas capital expenditures are not, okay? And while they both adjust your net operating income, they're treated differently for tax purposes, and they're treated differently in the sense of kind of what they are. And in other words, typically a capital expenditure is also kind of a one-time thing, not usually a recurring thing. Whereas a repair and maintenance, yeah, it's something you pretty much are going to be doing every year, replacing like filters and air conditioning systems and so forth. And if you have to replace an entire air conditioning system, this is where it gets interesting. That could be considered to be a repair and maintenance because you're just replacing what was already there and trying to maintain the operation of the property. But it also could be argued that if you're replacing maybe the existing air conditioning system with something that is a more energy efficient air conditioning system, higher quality, more expense, yada, 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 we might classify it as a capital expenditure, okay? And so, but typical examples of capital expenditures would be, this is something where we're really investing in a property to maybe elevate the property in some way and change it in potentially a substantive way. Like, let me put it yet another context. And we're going to, I can go ahead and tell the stories now, but let's say that you're replacing a roof, or you've got a roof on a commercial building. If you repair and kind of patch a little bit of that roof, that is clearly a repair and maintenance. But what if you rip the whole roof off and you put a whole new roof on? That's considered to be a capital expenditure, okay? Now, most of you are saying, I don't care. Why would I ever care about something like that? Well, you care because the tax treatment on those two things are very, very different, okay? Which we're going to be getting into later, not today, but in terms of how those get treated. And it can mean hundreds of thousands of millions of dollars of difference in how much you're going to be paying in income tax on that property as to how you classify one versus the other, okay? And the interesting thing is you will have property owners that will go out of their way in a very significant way to ensure that things get treated one way or the other, depending on what their specific, unique taxation issues are. Because it's not a one-size-fits-all, okay? So anyway, that's kind of precursor to what, CapEx is all about. Now, for the purposes of today, in terms of capital expenditures, all we really want to kind of say is, all right, you've got a property, and maybe it's generated $200,000 in net operating income for the year, and on a before, let me back up here a second. So let's just say, we want to go through the whole example. So let's just say we've got potential gross income of $500,000. We subtract out vacancies and collection losses of maybe $50,000. We add in other income of maybe, say $50,000 just to bring it back. All right, so that basically gives us then effective gross income of $500,000. All right, then we subtract out total operating expenses, which let's say are $300,000, and that would give us net operating income of $200,000. All right, so embedded within the $300,000, basically total operating expenses would be typically repairs and maintenance related things. Okay, does that make sense? Okay. Now, CapEx, strangely enough, typically the way that it still is treated, even though it's not an operating expense, what we will in many cases do is we will go ahead, at least for cash flow purposes, not for income tax purposes, but for cash flow purposes, say, okay, we're going to have maybe some CapEx expenses, let's say of $100,000, and then that is going to give us kind of an adjusted NOI of, so we've got 5,000 minus 300,000, which would be 200,000 minus 100,000 would give us now an adjusted NOI of 100,000. So from a cash flow perspective, we're sitting at 100,000. But here's the thing. What did I just say about CapEx? They're typically one-time expenses. They're typically non-repetitive, meaning that next year's NOI may not have any CapEx associated with it. Okay? So that's why that a lot of times property owners will typically leave out capital expenditures whenever calculating NOI, because it obviously deflates NOI, which directly impacts the overall value of the property. But from a purely cash flow perspective, yeah, you've got to subtract it out because it is an actual out-of-pocket expense. Does that make sense? Yes or no? Okay.
This is like a reserve, right?
Yeah, and it can be, yeah. But you could, once again, have money that you've been setting aside for reserves for replacement. And in some cases, that may be required and or dictated to you by your lender. Some lenders will simply say, you've got to set aside, I don't know, 10% of your effective gross income, or 10% of your net operating income, or whatever percentage they sort of come up with, and that is going to be put into kind of a reserve account for these potential unusual capital expenditures that may take place over the ownership period of the property. Okay? Make sense? Okay, moving forward.
There's just one thing I wanted to say. You were saying that that the adjusted NOI deflates the NOI and
Well,
the property, but at the other end, when you put this investment of the 100,000 of repair, doesn't it like upgrade the property?
It does upgrade the property, but it deflates the income in the sense of the short-term income on the property. That's why that you sometimes think of it like this. The way you make money off of a property is, okay, you buy it for this price, hopefully at some point in the future, maybe you sell it for something above that price, okay? So you make money off of just the inherent value that you've created in the property in some way. One, and you're absolutely right on this slide, one of the ways that you may enhance the value of the property is through certain capital expenditures that you may make that contribute to the long-term lasting value of the property. But let's not forget that one of the other ways that you make money off of a property is off of the operating cash flows that the property has over time. And whenever you're valuing a property, you are typically using that operating income, that operating cash flow, that net operating income as the number for your valuation, because you're applying a cap rate to that NOI and you're sort of saying that's the value. So if you artificially or you deflate the NOI by virtue of expensing all this capital expenditure here in this year, that isn't a true reflection of the property's performance, because that capital expenditure is really adding to the overall investment that you've made in the property as a whole, as opposed to a short-term operating expense. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. But, and this is one of the things that a lot of these things can be manipulated. And I hesitate using that word because then it sounds nefarious, it sounds illegal, it sounds, bad. But the reality is, like with most things in life, there are certain things that are reasonably absolute. Over here we have certain things with absolute certainty that are repairs and maintenance and would come out of operating expense money. Over here, we have certain things that are absolutely capital expenditures and would not be treated as a repair and maintenance. But then between those two, we have a tremendous amount of gray area as to how something gets classified, okay? And how it gets classified will impact the property's value, the property's taxation, and a whole number of other things, okay? All right. All right. So just in case you're sort of keeping score of where we are and how many more topics we've got 3 more topics, this one included, and then we'll be done. All right, so one of the things that we sometimes want to try to be able to do is to kind of get a handle on the differences that may exist in rental rates, and also try to understand to maybe compare one set of rental rates with another set of rental rates. And so some of the different ways that we sort of go about that, the most simple of all, if we've got, let's say, a 5-year lease, is to say, what is the average rental rate for that period of time? So let's just throw down some numbers. So let's say for we've got year 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And that maybe the rental rate is 20 in the first year, goes up to 22, then maybe goes up to 28, then to maybe 34, and then 35. Okay? So, very simply, if we wanted to just calculate the average rent over that 5-year period, easy peasy. Add them up, divide by 5. So let's just do that real quick. Where's my calculator? There we go.
$27.80.
So 139 divided by 5, yep, 27.80 basically per square foot per year would be just a simple average. Now, why is that simple average maybe not good enough for us? Because it doesn't factor in any sort of time value of money. Because clearly, this first year, 20 bucks a square foot is very different than 35 bucks a square foot, okay? And we're getting the 20 bucks a square foot a heck of a lot sooner than we are the 35, okay? So we need to make probably some sort of an adjustment to this simple average to make it maybe a bit more meaningful to us, okay? Because of the time value of money. So what we want to do is probably say, all right, we want to apply maybe a 10% discount rate to those sort of average rents. So in other words, what we want to do is we want to calculate a net present value, okay, for, in essence, this set of rents, okay? Now your financial calculator, pretty straightforward. This is going to be basically one payment per year. And put in 10% as our interest rate. And you can also do this on Excel, you know, that's kind of your choice. All right? Then, if you're doing it on the financial calculator and also sort of in Excel, you're going to sort of say, well, okay, we've got sort of time period 0, which is basically right here, right now. We're sort of making the assumption we don't receive that first year's rent until the end of the year. And I'm going to talk about that here in just a second. So I'm going to go ahead and put 0 as our initial cash flow. Then we're going to put in 20, 22, 28, 34, and 35. Then we're able to just simply solve for net present value, and what that's going to do is in essence give us sort of the present value of all of that rent combined to us today. So in other words, instead of just adding them up like we did here and getting $139, if you will, here this is going to give us something less than that is going to be more of a time-adjusted return. And so you end up with 102, 35, 36, roughly. And so, in essence, that's going to be probably, we can sort of say that that's going to be the present value of our sort of effective rent. Okay? Whereas, obviously our average rent is $27.80, but our total rent received over 5 years would be $139. So this is kind of the equivalent to the $139, except that this value has been discounted by 10% And what we're trying to do there is account for the risk, account for the time, account for other investment opportunities by using that 10% discount rate. Okay? Make sense? Now, if, just for fun, if you were to put in 0 right here as your interest rate, and then resolve for net present value, you get 139. So in other words, the number there. So all this is really doing is it's discounting the 139 back to the present using the 10% discount rate. Okay? Everybody cool with that? Yes or no?
That's a continue on calculator thing?
Yes.
But do we have to do this 102 then also divided by 5 in order to have the
No,
yield?
you're not gonna divide by 5, okay? That would not be the most accurate way of doing it. The more accurate way of taking it to the next step would be start over, clear everything out, and put in the 102.36 as your present value. Put in 5 years as your term. Put in 10% as your discount rate. And then to get the annual sort of equivalent, you're going to solve for payment. And what that's going to do is basically, that's going to tell you on an annualized basis what your effective rent would be. Okay? So let's do that real quick. And so what I get, $27, basically right on the money. All right? So 27, in one sense, if you want to think of it, that's a per year sort of effective rent versus 2780 would have been the rent, obviously, just based on an average. So not a huge difference, really, if you really look at it on a per dollar basis. But that 2780 reflects, we're going to simply call this the effective net rent, okay? Whereas this was called the present value of the effective rent. This was sort of called the average. But what we're really solving for here, this is what we're really looking for, hint, hint, is the quiz question, effective net rent, okay? All right.
Excuse me, the $27 is the effective net rent and the $27.80 is what?
Our average. This is a simple average up here. In other words, this simple average does not take into account time value of money, whereas this does. Okay? It's not a huge difference, but it's more accurate. Okay, moving forward. Almost there. All right. One of the things that may, operative word being may, be available to a tenant is the ability to sublet their space. Or, in other words, let's say that I've got a space that I have a 15-year lease on, and I no longer need maybe all the space that I've leased. Can I just simply say, okay, I don't really need all this space, because I've downsized as a company, and it could be office space, it could be retail space. I've downsized, and so I'm going to basically sublet some of the space within the property that I have to another tenant. Okay? Does that make sense? Yes? I mean, it happens all the time. I mean, like with office tenants, I mean, imagine you're a law firm, just to kind of use this as an example. You know, your law firm, for whatever reason, downsized. Maybe you lost a major client, okay? And so you no longer need, you know, what, 20,000 square feet of space. Maybe you only need 15,000 square feet of space. So you've got 5,000 square feet of space that potentially is going to be sitting empty for the next 15 years because of your lease, all right? So, you know, what are your options? Well, I mean, chances are your landlord's going to say, too bad, so sad, you know, you signed a 15-year lease, you're obligated to that space for the next 15 years, you figure it out. And usually, you figuring that out means saying, well, maybe we need to find, you know, some other parallel or compatible tenants that we can put into that 5,000 square feet that may or may not be attorneys, they might be accountants, they might be, you know, just, you know, a tech company, they could be almost anything, but the point being is we as the law firm, in one sense, are saying we need to occupy that 5,000 square feet of space, so we're going to rent it out to these other tenants. Does that make sense to everybody? Yes or no? Okay, now, part of the question as it relates to some of this sort of subletting stuff is, you know, it could also be, I mean, it's twisted another way or contorted another way. Let's say that we're a law firm and maybe it's not the issue of us losing clients or losing money. Let's just say that we become more efficient. That maybe more of our attorneys are able now post-COVID to work from home. We no longer need as much space as we once did now that we know that our employees can be productive working at home and not having to utilize office space. So as a result, we're going to try to, you know, lease that office space out because we don't need it and it costs us money. Okay, does that make sense? Yes? Okay, now, so what could be the case, let's say that we leased space at $45 per square foot per year. And we had, what was it, 20,000 square feet. Okay, so that works out to be $900,000 a year. Okay, everybody's good with that. Now, what we're saying is that, okay, we've got 5,000 square feet that maybe we can sublet. And it doesn't have to be at the same price that we actually paid. It could be a bit more. So what's to say that we couldn't charge the sublet tenant $50 per square foot? All right. So in that case, $250,000. Okay, now, depending on, obviously the scenario that I think I had said previously was, all right, we're leasing the entire 20,000 for 45 bucks a square foot, but we're going to sublease basically 5,000 of that at 50 bucks a square foot. So in one sense, what we're sort of saying is that this difference of $5 that we're going to, in essence, get for that 5,000 square feet of $25,000 a year is going to be extra income to us. Okay? Does that make sense? Does the scenario make sense?
So the 5,000 is from the total 20,000. So tenant number one is essentially paying for something that they're not using?
Well, okay, keep in mind, yes, but then they are being paid more for that. In other words, the landlord is being paid $900,000. Okay? Does that make sense? For the entire.
To tenant B for an additional $25,000 a year.
Correct.
Their space they're not using.
So basically, what's happening is that the primary tenant that is leasing out this 5,000 of their space. So in other words, the way to think of it is, in one sense, 15,000 square feet are being still leased by the primary tenant, 5,000 is being leased by this sublet tenant, but the sublet tenant is paying $5,000 more, okay, or basically, not $5,000 more, is paying $5 per square foot per year more for that 5,000 square feet, okay? Does that make sense? So in other words, this is an incremental value to the tenant, okay? So, in other words, here's another way simply to look at it. If I am the primary tenant, I am walking away with $25,000 a year of extra cash money in my back pocket. Landlord's not getting a penny of this, okay? This is me as the tenant getting an extra $25,000 a year. Now the question is, how much is that? If we said we had a 15-year lease, how much is that really worth to me? Well, $25,000 a year times 15 years, that's $375,000 of just raw cash that it's worth to me. But if we discount that and we sort of say we use a 10% discount rate on that, we could simply say, okay, one payment per year. Well, I want to come back to that in a second as well. Okay, we got $25,000 as a payment. We want to discount that at 10% for 15 years and solve for basically what is the present value of that savings. Or not savings, but present value of that extra income. And we end up with $190,151, 98.99, which is once again the discounted equivalent to basically the overall savings. But the reason why this number is substantially less is because we're not getting all this money at once. We're getting it over 15 years, okay? And we're obviously discounting it at a 10% discount rate. Now, once again, just kind of like the previous problem, if we kind of go back in here and we sort of say, okay, well, let's just put a 0 as our interest rate or discount rate, and we resolve for present value, look at what you get. The $375,000, undiscounted, okay? But what we are searching for is the discounted value. Okay, make sense? All right? Whew. Almost there. All right. Oh, one thing I did want to say, and we'll get on the last topic.
What would the question be in this scenario?
What's the discounted value of that extra income?
So the 190,000 is the discounted value of the extra income.
Yeah, the extra $25,000 a year for 15 years.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. So one of the things that I want to make sure that I mention, I was thinking about it a while ago, but it just I didn't get a chance to articulate the thought. So one of the things that I said a little while ago is that we generally make the assumption that even though a lease starts at the beginning of the year, we don't recognize that income until the end of the year. Okay, thus is why we've got this, zero as our initial cash flow at time period 0, and we don't recognize the first bit of income until the end of the year. And some of you are just like, I don't understand. Okay, think of it like this. Throughout the course of the year, you get your rental income. You get your monthly checks as the property owner from your tenants at the beginning of each month. So January 1st, you get a check, and then your last check comes in December 1st, okay, for the 12 months for that year. All right, from an accounting perspective, what we do is we sort of say, okay, yeah, the check comes in at the beginning of each month or beginning of each year, whatever it is, but the reality is, by the time that we process that check and we subtract out any and all expenses associated with that rent check, it's not until kind of the end of the period or end of the month or end of the year that we sort of have realized that income in terms of it existing to us. Does that make sense? So that is the reason why virtually all of the income that you will see attributed to real estate, we always make the assumption that the payment or receipt or acknowledgement or recognition of that income does not occur until the end of the month or end of the year. Does that make sense? Yes or no? Okay? All right, moving forward. That was just a side topic, but I think it's an important one to mention. Okay, last little topic, super basic, leasing commissions. All right, about 10 minutes to get through this, which we can get through. Okay. So for commercial real estate, things are maybe a little bit different than they are for residential as it relates to leasing commissions. And by that, what I mean is that you, as a leasing broker, leasing agent, you typically will get paid your full leasing commission for leasing out a commercial property for like a multiple year sort of leasing arrangement. You will get paid normally that entire leasing commission at the execution of the lease. Okay? Now, me personally, as a developer, as an investor, as the guy who has to pay that leasing commission, I hate that. I absolutely hate it. Because what happens if you get a tenant that you basically have executed a 5-year lease, 6 months after they move in, they go bankrupt. I've just paid a leasing commission on a 5-year lease that maybe, in some cases, as much as the amount of revenue that I received over those first few months before they went bankrupt. Not to mention now, I've got to release the property again and pay yet another leasing commission. Does that make sense, yes or no? Now, those people on the other side of the fence, that are the leasing agents, leasing brokers, and so forth, they have a very different perspective. And their perspective is one, look, I had to go chasing all around town to find the tenant that had the interest in your property, hopefully had the financial fortitude and everything, ready, willing, and able kind of tenant. And I spent all this time and effort, money, I need to be paid for that. Now, and I need to be paid for it now. My argument, counter to that would be, I have no problem with paying you some of that leasing commission up front. Matter of fact, I would be more than happy to engage in an arrangement where I maybe pay for the first year of leasing related commissions. And then every year you get kind of almost like an annuity payment as the leasing agent. Or even pay you every month, quite frankly, as the tenant pays, I get paid, I pay you. Now, any of you that have been leasing agents, you're going to say, I hate that. And I'm like, I understand. But the market, as a general rule, has drifted, for years to this whole model of basically prepaying commissions on leases and treating them, for all intents and purposes, like a sale of real estate, okay, and having all the commission paid up front, okay? Does that make sense, yes or no? Okay, before we get into the calculation aspect of this, will be the last calculation for the day. Thoughts, comments, observations on that? I know you're worn out, but come on, you can rally for one more little discussion point. I know you can. Come on.
I personally hate it also to pay all the commission in the beginning, because sometimes the tenants move out and I have to redo the whole thing again.
Yeah, I mean, the worst nightmare that I have, as a property owner, developer, that sort of thing, is, all right, number one, I go through, build everything, get everything done, ready for occupancy, all right, somebody, goes and finds me a tenant to occupy the property, I spend all this money potentially on tenant improvements and pay this leasing commission up front, and then the tenant is out of business in 3 months, and I'm just like, no, that is a bad, evil kind of situation to ever allow someone's, self to get into. Thankfully, I have not been in that situation, but I have known plenty of other property owners that have been in a very, similar predicament, and it's not pretty, because it's a lot of upfront expenditures, and then you just are just more like, poof, it's all gone. And in some cases, you're able to recover, some cases you're not. Okay?
But on the other hand, you can also then ask for not giving another commission afterwards when they renew the leases.
And that's also another piece to this, is that yes, that whenever the lease comes due 5 years from now, on the lease renewal, it's possible that the leasing agent may want a piece of that as well. And once again, you can make the argument, well, do they deserve it? What do they really do? So anyway, I'm not trying to be negative about leasing agents. They do perform a function, but sometimes you have to kind of say in terms of compensation, what's fair, what's not. Okay, moving forward with the calculation. So let's say that the leasing commission on this property is 1.5% of total value of the lease. Okay? So, we've got a property. Tell me, how many square feet is our property?
15,000.
Okay, 15,000 square feet. All right, and what is our lease rate in terms of an annual rental rate on this property?
$18 now.
$18 per square foot, okay. Okay, and how long is the lease term?
Years.
How many?
5 years.
5 years, okay. So let's sort of start off. Okay, 15,000 times 18 bucks is 270,000 per year. Times 5 years. $1,350,000 total. So basically all we're going to do is we're going to take the $1,350,000, multiply it by 0.015, okay? 1.5%. And so the leasing commission on that would be $20,250. Okay? Make sense? Okay. All right. That's it. Any other questions, comments, observations? So once again, for those of you that maybe came in a little bit late, just make sure that you look in Canvas. You'll notice that quiz 1 will be available in about 2 minutes at 11:15. Once you start it, you must complete it, but you don't have to start it until Monday, and it's due by midnight on Monday, so you would need to start it obviously by around 11 o'clock on Monday night at the latest in order to be done with it. Outside of that, any questions?
The quiz attempts are only one?
I'm sorry?
There's only one attempt on the quizzes?
Absolutely, one attempt only. And it is timed at 45 minutes, so that's basically 4.5 minutes per question. Okay? All right, any other questions?
Yeah, I have a question regarding what we pay the commission agents. You know, it's assuming a new development. In the